Griselda Blanco's name still echoes through the shadows of the drug world, a tale of ruthless ambition and unimaginable power. But behind the legend lies a haunting question. What is the true cost of chasing the crown when every move could be your last? Griselda Blanco's story begins in the shadow of poverty, in the violent streets of Cartagena, Colombia, where she was born in 1943. Growing up, she faced hardships that would break most, but not her. Raised in a slum, Blanco's early life was defined by a lack of resources, a fractured family, and a relentless hunger for something more than the life she was born into. Her mother, a woman who struggled to keep the family together, couldn't provide the stability that Griselda needed, and her father was a distant figure who had long since abandoned the family. The streets, with all their danger and allure, became her true family. Blanco learned early on that survival was a game of power, manipulation, and brutality. At the age of 11, she was already involved in petty thefts and street hustles, slowly inching her way up in the criminal underworld. She stole and sold goods, becoming a familiar face in the criminal circles. But Griselda wasn't just interested in small-time crime. From a young age, she had a ruthless ambition, a vision that stretched far beyond petty theft. She wanted more, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get it. This ambition would soon propel her into a world where only the most dangerous and cunning survived. Her rise to power wasn't an accident. Blanco was a sharp observer of the people around her, calculating her moves with the precision of a seasoned strategist. She understood the value of loyalty, and she used it to build a network of associates who would help her realize her vision. In her early 20s, Blanco moved to the United States, seeking to escape the chaos of Colombia's streets, but also to build an empire of her own. She arrived in New York City, where she began running small-time rackets, before eventually finding her way to the sunny shores of Miami, where the burgeoning cocaine trade would provide the foundation for her empire. By the time she settled in Miami, Blanco had already earned a reputation for being cold and calculating. Her ability to make people trust her, only to betray them for personal gain, was unrivaled. She built a network of smugglers, dealers, and corrupt officials, all of whom played key roles in Blanco's operations. She didn't just enter the cocaine trade, she dominated it, controlling the flow of drugs from Colombia into the U.S. Her ability to remain invisible, to operate in the shadows while pulling the strings of the world around her, was her true gift. Blanco's rise from the slums of Colombia to the heights of the drug trade was nothing short of a testament to her ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance, setting the stage for her reign as the cocaine godmother. Griselda Blanco's transformation from a child of poverty to a ruthless force in the criminal underworld began in the grim streets of Colombia. Her early years were marked by hardship and loss, but it was in the shadow of these struggles that her thirst for power and control was born. Blanco didn't see the world through the lens of innocence or morality. She saw it as a battlefield where only the strong survived. Poverty wasn't just an inconvenience to her, it was a force that drove her every decision. The streets were the only teachers she ever had, and they taught her the harshest lessons. At the age of 13, Blanco was already involved in petty theft, stealing from markets, and learning how to manipulate people to get what she wanted. But as she grew older, the small-time crimes no longer satisfied her. Blanco was driven by a relentless desire to escape the chains of poverty that bound her family and herself. Every theft, every hustled deal, was a step towards something greater, a world where she could hold power, command, respect, and finally escape the life she was born into. It was a hunger that led her into the arms of the criminal underworld, where opportunities were plentiful, but the consequences were deadly. By her late teens, Blanco had left behind her childhood life of petty crime and gravitated toward more dangerous pursuits. The allure of drug trafficking was irresistible, an industry where immense wealth and power were within arm's reach. She wasn't interested in being just another face in the crowd of criminals. She wanted to be at the top, controlling the flow of narcotics and the lives of those who worked for her. Blanco understood that to escape poverty, she would need to master the art of brutality and deception. In the dangerous world she was entering, trust was a luxury, and only those who could outsmart, outfight, and outlive their enemies made it to the top. Her entry into the drug trade was marked by a swift and calculated rise. Blanco didn't wait for opportunities to come to her. She created them. She built connections with people who could provide her with the means to smuggle cocaine into the United States. As she became more entrenched in the drug trade, Blanco's reputation for ruthlessness grew. She wasn't just a participant, she was a key player, orchestrating the logistics of drug shipments, setting up her own distribution networks, and eliminating anyone who stood in her way. Her life was no longer defined by the struggles of her childhood, but by a new set of rules, ones that dictated success, not by morals, but by the ability to dominate and control. Blanco's desire to escape poverty had evolved into a singular drive for power and influence. Her early life had taught her that nothing came without sacrifice, and she was willing to sacrifice everything, morality, loyalty, even her own soul, to escape the life she had known and create one where she would never again be powerless. Griselda Blanco's first steps into the world of organized crime were neither subtle nor small. Her rise wasn't born from careful planning or quiet ambition. It was thrust upon her by the desperate need to survive. As a young woman in her late teens, Blanco wasn't just content with the small-time scams and petty thefts that had filled her early years. She was determined to carve her own path, to make a name for herself in the underworld. The streets of Medellin became her training ground, and it didn't take long for her to attract the attention of the city's most dangerous criminals. Her first real taste of the criminal life came with a series of heists, small jobs, but each one more daring and more lucrative than the last. Blanco quickly proved that she was as sharp as any of the men around her, with a knack for outsmarting those who underestimated her. It was during one of these heists that she first crossed paths with the world of drug trafficking. Blanco's ambition wasn't satisfied with petty theft, and the rise of the cocaine trade offered a tantalizing opportunity. She saw the immense wealth to be made in the business, and she wasn't afraid to take risks to claim her share. Her entry into the drug trade was both opportunistic and calculated. Blanco began to build connections with established figures in the world of smuggling, leveraging her street smarts and ruthless determination to secure her place. She quickly learned the inner workings of the business, how to transport large quantities of drugs across borders, how to establish a network of loyal distributors, and most importantly, how to protect her empire. It didn't take long for her to realize that control was the key to survival in this world. She wasn't just content with being a small player in the game. Blanco aimed to control the flow of cocaine, to own the streets. Her first major shipment was an unremarkable one in the grand scheme of things. But for Blanco, it marked the beginning of her transformation from a small-time thief into a force to be reckoned with. She didn't just move the product. She moved with authority, commanding respect from those around her. Blanco knew that trust was earned in this world, and she was prepared to use every ounce of her cunning and ruthlessness to take what she wanted. Her first blood was drawn not with a gun, but with the quiet, calculated maneuvers of a criminal mind at work. From that point on, there was no going back. Blanco had tasted power, and like any predator, she was hooked. The cocaine trade would be her domain, and she would stop at nothing to make it hers. Griselda Blanco's ambition was like a fire, quiet at first, but steadily building until it could no longer be contained. Once she tasted the power of the cocaine trade, the game changed for her. It wasn't enough to simply be a part of it anymore. She needed to control it. She had an insatiable desire to climb, to carve her own niche, and to dominate a world that, for most, remained beyond reach. But Blanco wasn't like most people. She understood the underworld's unspoken rules and played the game better than anyone. As she started to gain traction, Blanco's cunning became more apparent. She didn't throw herself into the spotlight like some of the brash, loud criminals around her. Instead, she operated from the shadows, preferring to make moves that left no trace. Her ability to stay under the radar, to quietly build an empire while avoiding unnecessary attention, set her apart from her rivals. She understood the importance of patience, of letting things simmer and grow, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Blanco wasn't just a player, she was a strategist. She built alliances with precision, always staying one step ahead of those who would try to take her down. Blanco's ambition wasn't about mere wealth, it was about power. The kind of power that made people bend to your will, that made you untouchable. She didn't just want to be a smuggler, she wanted to be the kingpin of the trade. She worked tirelessly to expand her network, creating a complex web of contacts, suppliers, and distributors that spanned not just the United States, but the world. Every connection she made, every shipment she moved, and every person she controlled was a step closer to her goal of complete domination. Her rise was marked by calculated risks and strategic moves that left her competitors scrambling to catch up. But Blanco's ambition came at a price. She was ruthless in ways that shocked even the most hardened criminals. Loyalty was something she demanded, not earned, and she had no qualms about eliminating anyone who threatened her empire. Betrayal, no matter how small, was met with swift and often violent retribution. Blanco's ability to ruthlessly eliminate her enemies, combined with her strategic foresight, allowed her to take control of a massive cocaine operation that stretched across continents. Her power, however, didn't just stem from her ability to control the drug trade. It came from her complete lack of fear. Where others hesitated, Blanco acted. She took risks that others wouldn't dare, believing that fortune favored the bold. Her ambition and cunning set her apart, transforming her from a small-time hustler into one of the most feared figures in the world of organized crime. As her influence grew, so did her reputation soon. Griselda Blanco wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of the power she had worked so hard to build. Griselda Blanco's entry into the world of international cocaine smuggling marked the beginning of a criminal empire that would go on to dominate the drug trade for years. She wasn't the first to see the potential in cocaine, but she was one of the first to recognize how to turn it into an empire. Blanco understood that the key to success wasn't just moving product, it was in controlling the flow, managing the routes, and eliminating competition before it even had a chance to challenge her. Her vision was clear from the start. She would build a network that was as efficient as it was ruthless, one that spanned across continents, leaving no room for rivals to survive. Blanco's initial foray into cocaine trafficking wasn't built on the standard routes that others used. She quickly recognized the need to carve out her own path, one that would be harder to trace, more profitable, and more secure. She began by establishing smuggling routes from Colombia to the United States, primarily targeting the lucrative Miami market. The city, with its proximity to South America, was the perfect gateway for Blanco's cocaine shipments. It wasn't long before she began creating her own airstrips in Colombia, using private planes to ferry cocaine directly into Florida. These flights bypassed the standard routes, evading detection by authorities, and allowed Blanco to move large quantities of cocaine without raising suspicion. The success of her smuggling operations relied on more than just the transportation of cocaine. It was about securing her network. Blanco didn't simply rely on suppliers and distributors. She made sure that every aspect of her empire was under her control. She forged alliances with other criminals, politicians, and law enforcement, ensuring that her shipments made it to their destinations without interference. She used bribery and intimidation in equal measure to ensure loyalty, and anyone who betrayed her or attempted to disrupt her operations met a swift and often brutal end. Blanco's cocaine empire wasn't limited to just one method of transportation. As her business grew, so did the sophistication of her operations. She moved from planes to boats and even submarines to transport the drugs. The scale of her operations was staggering. By the early 1980s. She was moving tons of cocaine into the U.S. each month, and her empire was estimated to be worth billions. Her routes were not just limited to Miami. They stretched to major cities across the country, with Blanco establishing a network of distributors, enforcers, and smugglers who worked under her iron fist. But it wasn't just the logistics that made Blanco's empire so successful. It was her ability to anticipate and outmaneuver anyone who stood in her way. She built her empire on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and calculated risks. Blanco's cocaine operation wasn't just a business, it was a kingdom, and she ruled it with the same ruthlessness that had propelled her from the slums to the top of the drug trade. She had created something that would outlast her, a criminal legacy that would be remembered long after she was gone. Griselda Blanco's rise to power was nothing short of meteoric. From the moment she stepped into the cocaine trade, her ambition burned hotter than the streets she ruled. What started as small-time smuggling quickly evolved into an empire. Blanco wasn't content with merely being a player in the game. She set her sights on becoming the game itself. The first few years saw her perfecting the art of smuggling, learning how to navigate the treacherous waters of both the criminal world and law enforcement. But Blanco was a woman of fierce intelligence and unparalleled ruthlessness, and soon, the game would no longer be big enough for anyone else but her. Her influence grew steadily, but it was her ability to adapt that truly set her apart. She didn't just build a network, she built a kingdom. Blanco understood that power didn't just come from money, it came from control. She began to expand her operations, not just in size, but in scope. She connected with key players across the globe, establishing routes that spanned from Colombia to the United States and beyond. Her grip tightened around Miami, the heart of her empire, as she strategically placed her trusted men in every corner of the city. If the law enforcement couldn't be bought, they could be outsmarted. If rivals couldn't be bargained with, they could be eliminated. Blanco's world was one where betrayal was met with swift retribution. There was no room for weakness, and she demanded complete loyalty from those who worked for her. To ensure her hold on power, she surrounded herself with enforcers, men who didn't hesitate to eliminate threats. Her reputation for cruelty grew, and as it did, so did her power. Blanco didn't rely solely on violence, though. She was calculating, always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead of everyone else. She would create alliances, use people until they were no longer useful, and then discard them as if they were never there. Blanco's rise to power wasn't accidental. It was the result of years of meticulous planning, a carefully crafted web of connections and schemes. But power, as she quickly learned, was not something that could be held passively. The higher Blanco climbed, the more threats she faced, both from within and outside her circle. The Cali Cartel, once a quiet rival, began to rise in prominence, and with it, the pressure on Blanco increased. Yet, rather than retreating or shrinking from the challenge, Blanco responded with even more ferocity. She expanded her reach further into the U.S., moved product through new channels, and diversified her operations. No corner of the drug trade was safe from her grasp, and the more her power grew, the more her reputation as the cocaine godmother solidified. Her leadership was not born from fear alone, it was born from respect. Blanco's ability to maintain control, to expand her empire against all odds, and to eliminate anyone who threatened her, made her one of the most feared women in the world. She had risen not just as a player in the drug trade, but as its queen, a woman who had carved her name into the blood-soaked history of the cocaine empire. Griselda Blanco's family was her empire. She built it not just with cocaine and cash, but with loyalty and blood. Her family members, including her sons, were integral to the operation, more than just heirs to her criminal wealth. They were her partners, her trusted lieutenants, and, in some cases, her muscle. Blanco's bond with her family was complicated, defined by both love and control. She knew that in the world she had created, the only people she could truly trust were those closest to her. And so, her sons became deeply involved in her drug empire, managing different aspects of the operation as Blanco expanded her network of smuggling routes, distribution channels, and money laundering schemes. Her eldest son, Michael, was especially close to her, rising through the ranks quickly as Blanco's right-hand man. The family dynamic was one of mutual dependency. Blanco relied on her sons not just for emotional support, but for the operational backbone of her empire. It was a ruthless business, and she knew that the best way to ensure loyalty was to make sure her sons were as invested in it as she was. She had them managing smuggling operations, running errands, and building connections across Miami and beyond, establishing themselves as key players in the underworld. While many mothers may have seen their sons as a source of joy or pride, Blanco's approach was more pragmatic. For her, family was a means to an end, a way to secure her empire's survival. But the role her sons played was not without tension. Blanco's control over them was absolute, her expectations clear. They were to manage her business, carry out her orders, and protect the family at all costs. As Blanco's criminal empire expanded, the weight of the family's involvement grew heavier. Her sons were forced to navigate a brutal world, marked by constant danger and shifting alliances. The ever-present threat of betrayal, from within or outside the family, was something Blanco prepared them for. Her teachings were harsh, sometimes cruel, but they were grounded in the simple truth. Loyalty to the family was paramount, and anyone who betrayed it would face the consequences. The family business, however, was not just about her sons. Blanco also relied on a network of close associates, family members, friends, and trusted enforcers. Her inner circle was tight-knit, bound by both fear and respect. Blanco didn't just lead by brute force. She led by manipulation, rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty in equal measure. Her ability to maintain control over such a large operation, with so many moving parts, was a testament to her cold efficiency and her strategic use of family ties. Blanco's family business was not just a criminal operation, it was her legacy. She built it, shaped it, and ensured it would continue, even if that meant making her sons part of the very empire she had created. In the end, they were more than her children. They were her successors, carrying on her work long after she would be gone. Griselda Blanco's methods were as feared as they were effective, a combination of manipulation, intimidation, and unflinching violence that left no room for weakness. She understood that in the world she inhabited, power was not given, it had to be seized, maintained, and protected at all costs. Blanco didn't just build a criminal empire. She fashioned an environment where betrayal was not an option, and loyalty was enforced with the coldest of measures. Her presence alone was enough to command fear. Blanco didn't need to speak loudly or make grand threats. Her reputation did the work for her. She was known for her ability to make enemies disappear, often without leaving a trace. Her approach was simple: create a culture where those who crossed her knew their lives were expendable. She could bring the hammer down at any time, but the real genius of her methods lay in the subtlety with which she wielded her power. Blanco often played both sides, appearing to offer favors and gifts, only to tighten the grip when someone least expected it. She would build people up just to tear them down, ensuring they remained under her control. A well-timed gesture of generosity was just as valuable as a calculated act of cruelty. She built a network of loyalty based on fear, but also on the understanding that anyone who survived the game with her was more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Blanco's ruthlessness wasn't confined to her enemies. It extended to those within her own ranks. She ran her empire like a well-oiled machine, but machines needed enforcers. Blanco used violence when necessary, and when it came to those who crossed her, she didn't hesitate to take things to the extreme. She had a network of hitmen, many of them trusted family members or longtime associates, who were loyal to her above all else. They didn't ask questions, they simply followed orders. There were countless stories of men and women who had defied her, only to end up murdered in the most brutal ways. Blanco's enemies were often found beaten, shot, or strangled, their bodies left to serve as a stark reminder of what happened when someone challenged her. But Blanco wasn't just a master of violence. She was also a master manipulator. She knew how to play the game of power, making people believe they were essential to her operation, even when they weren't. She would reward loyalty with money and power, but those rewards always came with strings attached. Blanco's mind was a labyrinth of deals and double deals, where nothing was ever truly as it seemed. She understood human nature better than anyone, knowing when to offer a kind word, when to exploit weakness, and when to strike. Her methods, while extreme, were what kept her at the top. In the volatile world of cocaine trafficking, Blanco created an empire that withstood the scrutiny of law enforcement, rival cartels, and political pressure. No one dared to challenge her for fear of the consequences. She was a godmother in the truest sense of the word, dispensing both favors and punishments with an iron grip, never letting go of the empire she had worked so hard to build. The cocaine cowboys era was a time when Miami transformed from a sun-soaked paradise into the battleground of an all-out drug war. At the center of it was Griselda Blanco, the woman who would come to be known as the godmother of cocaine. Blanco's influence over the city was undeniable. She wasn't just a part of the cocaine trade. She was its architect. During the height of the 1980s, Miami became the epicenter of the United States cocaine epidemic, and Blanco's empire was a force that shaped the city's criminal landscape. The war for control of the cocaine trade was ferocious, violent, and deadly. Rival cartels clashed on the streets, and the battle for dominance saw blood spilled in broad daylight. Blanco's cocaine was transported into Miami by the ton, and she was the one who built the intricate networks that delivered it into the hands of dealers across the city. Her trafficking routes were expansive, connecting her operation to Colombia, the Caribbean, and the U.S. The cocaine cowboys were the young, ruthless men working for her, the dealers and gunmen who ruled the streets, often gunned down in the open in brutal gangland executions. Blanco herself, however, remained an enigma, operating from the shadows and pulling the strings with a level of cunning that few could match. Her reputation grew along with the chaos she helped create. Blanco wasn't just a dealer, she was a queenpin, a woman who commanded respect through violence, manipulation, and strategy. While the streets of Miami ran red with the blood of those caught in the war, Blanco's empire expanded exponentially. The cocaine flowed freely into the U.S., and with it, so did the money. Miami became a city where wealth and death intertwined, and Blanco, with her icy demeanor and ruthless methods, ruled it all. The brutality of the cocaine cowboys era was fueled by Blanco's uncompromising need for control. She instilled a culture of violence within her organization, where betrayal was met with swift and brutal punishment. The bodies of those who crossed her were often left on display, a grim warning to anyone who might think to challenge her power. Yet, despite the violence, Blanco's cartel thrived, accumulating vast wealth as she continued to cement her position as the queen of cocaine. The violence and bloodshed, though, were not just symptoms of a drug war, they were Blanco's signature. The tools she used to maintain her dominance in the increasingly competitive world of cocaine trafficking. Miami, with its palm-lined streets and neon-lit nights, was the perfect stage for Blanco's rise. A city ripe for the taking. The cocaine cowboys were both her soldiers and her ghosts, men who carried out her orders with chilling efficiency, bringing her vision of domination to life. But as the empire expanded, so did the pressure from law enforcement and rival cartels. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed inevitable that the inevitable confrontation would come. Yet, for a time, Blanco seemed untouchable, a shadow in the city's bright lights, pulling the strings of the cocaine trade with terrifying precision. The cocaine cowboys era would forever be marked by her presence, a testament to a woman who, for a while, controlled the flow of cocaine in one of America's most dangerous and infamous cities. Miami was the heart of Griselda Blanco's empire, a city that would forever be marked by her bloody fingerprints. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Miami wasn't just a tropical tourist destination. It became the epicenter of cocaine trafficking into the United States, and Blanco was at the center of it all. She orchestrated a massive, covert operation that spanned the length of the city, from the glittering beaches to the urban sprawl, turning Miami into a war zone where blood and money flowed in equal measure. Blanco's operation in Miami was sleek, secretive, and efficient, a web of routes and contacts that moved tons of cocaine into the country every week. Her smuggling network was vast, with connections in Colombia, the Caribbean, and across the U.S., and she made sure that the goods arrived undisturbed. Blanco's strategy was simple yet deadly: control the streets, control the flow, and eliminate anyone who threatened that power. Her methods were swift and brutal, and the fear she instilled in her competitors kept her in charge. She controlled the distribution from the moment the drugs hit the shores to the instant they reached the hands of dealers. Blanco's Miami operation wasn't just about moving drugs, it was about moving an empire. She built an infrastructure that included airstrips in the swamps of Florida, warehouses to store the cocaine, and a vast network of loyal foot soldiers who handled the dangerous work of moving the drugs across the city. It wasn't just the logistics that made her operation effective. It was the intimidation, the violence, and the fear that kept competitors at bay. Rival cartels tried to muscle in, but Blanco's tactics were ruthless. She used her power to stay one step ahead, employing a mix of bribery, violence, and manipulation to keep law enforcement and competitors off her back. The true scope of Blanco's Miami operations became clear as the city became overrun with drugs, bloodshed, and greed. The streets were filled with young men who worshipped her, and the neighborhoods that she controlled became war zones where dealers clashed with one another, often at the behest of Blanco herself. Many of her most trusted enforcers were family members or close associates, and their loyalty was secured through fear and money. Blanco kept a tight grip on her empire, allowing little room for error. Her surveillance was tight, her presence in the operations was constant, and her control over the streets was unyielding. But the cost of this power came with constant danger. As her empire expanded, so did the risks. Blanco lived under the threat of betrayal, rival attacks, and the encroaching force of law enforcement. However, for a while, she was untouchable, a shadow moving through the streets of Miami, where every corner, every alley, and every warehouse held another part of her vast drug empire. Blanco's Miami operations not only enriched her, but solidified her legacy as one of the most notorious figures in the history of the drug trade. Her name became synonymous with the violence and chaos that gripped the city, and even as law enforcement closed in, her operation remained a testament to her ingenuity, ruthlessness, and unshakable control over one of the deadliest cities in America. Griselda Blanco's grip over the Miami drug scene was as firm as the city's relentless heat. She ruled with an iron fist, and those who dared to cross her quickly learned the consequences of defiance. Her reputation was not just built on the cocaine she moved, but on the terror she instilled in anyone who dared to challenge her. Blanco's influence stretched beyond the drug trade. It permeated the streets, the homes, the very air of Miami, where her name was spoken in hushed tones, with both fear and awe. Blanco wasn't just a drug queenpin. She was an executioner in the shadows. Her rise to power was marked by a series of ruthless acts, from the violent elimination of competitors to the cold-blooded executions of her own people when they betrayed her. She ruled through fear, using violence not as a last resort, but as a first instinct. If someone owed her money, if a dealer stepped out of line, if a rival cartel dared to move into her territory, Blanco didn't hesitate. A gunshot or a well-placed bomb was all it took to send a message that she was untouchable. Her violent methods were as efficient as they were deadly. Blanco's hitmen, known for their chilling precision, carried out her orders without question. The streets of Miami became battlegrounds, with bloodshed as frequent as the traffic jams that plagued the city. Rival cartels and dealers feared her, not just for her business acumen, but for her willingness to use any means necessary to maintain control. Her enforcers, most of them loyal, often looked the other way when she dispatched someone with a cold smile and a steady hand. Blanco's efficiency in the drug trade was legendary. She didn't waste time, and she certainly didn't waste people. Her network of operations, from the Colombia-based suppliers to the street dealers in Miami, ran like clockwork. Each drug shipment, each route, each transaction was meticulously planned and executed with military-like precision. Blanco herself was often seen as a ghost, always in the background, never flashy, but always present. She knew every detail of her operation, and she trusted no one with the knowledge of more than their small piece of the puzzle. In the world she created, loyalty was earned through fear and power, not affection or respect. The people around her knew that crossing her wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. Her network was so well established that even law enforcement couldn't penetrate it. The police tried, of course, but Blanco's operations were too well protected, too insulated from the public eye. She had too many contacts, too many people on the inside, and too many ways to cover her tracks. Blanco's influence was undeniable. Miami, once a vibrant city of beaches and nightlife, had transformed into the heart of the cocaine empire, a city defined by her violence, her efficiency, and her unstoppable rise to power. She was a woman who built her empire, not on charm or alliances, but on raw, unyielding force. In her world, there was no room for weakness, and no one was spared when it came to enforcing her rule. Griselda Blanco had made herself an indomitable force, a name feared and respected throughout Miami's underworld. The cartel wars were the blood-soaked battlegrounds where Griselda Blanco's empire clashed with rivals, each conflict feeding the flames of destruction and power. Blanco's rise had not gone unnoticed, and as her operation expanded, so did the targets on her back. In the high-stakes world of drug trafficking, there was no room for second place, and rival cartels fought tooth and nail to take what Blanco had built. The streets of Miami, once a playground of tourists and sunshine, became the theater for a brutal war that knew no mercy. Blanco's cartel, known for its efficiency and ruthlessness, was an immovable force. But as its reach grew, so did the competition. The Medellin and Cali cartels, along with smaller factions, took notice of Blanco's growing power in Miami and began their own attempts to infiltrate, or more often, eliminate her. These weren't the kind of wars fought with legal teams and negotiations. These were wars of terror, of violence, and of men who knew no rule except their own ambition. Blanco's response was swift and brutal. Betrayals from within her own ranks were met with swift executions, often public, to remind the streets of her power. In her world, loyalty wasn't just a virtue. It was the price of survival. She used violence not just to eliminate threats, but to send a message to the others who might try to challenge her. It wasn't just the men who faced the consequences of crossing her. She wouldn't hesitate to strike down their families, their businesses, anyone who might be seen as a potential risk. The wars were not limited to just the streets. The battle for control over key trafficking routes, smuggling operations, and airstrips often turned deadly. Trucks carrying loads of cocaine were hijacked. Warehouses were burned to the ground, and planes full of drugs were intercepted mid-flight. Blanco fought not only with her own cartel's muscle, but with her strategic alliances, pulling strings to get her enemies eliminated, one by one, from the inside. Each hit, each blow, each strike was a calculated move in a game where the stakes were as high as the blood that flowed. But the violence didn't stop there. Blanco's empire became embroiled in a network of corruption and betrayal, with law enforcement, politicians, and even her own associates compromising her operations. As the violence escalated, Blanco's trust in others began to erode. She had learned early on that loyalty was a commodity she could buy, but once you had it, you had to hold on to it with an iron grip. And in the midst of this volatile period, Blanco's paranoia grew. She could trust no one, not even those closest to her, as her enemies were often within her own ranks. The wars between Blanco's cartel and rival factions were marked by a constant ebb and flow of control. The city of Miami became a city under siege, where every new shipment of cocaine, every new drug route, and every new business venture was a potential battleground. Bloodshed was inevitable in a world where only the strongest survived, and Blanco proved time and time again that she was not someone to be underestimated. In the end, her cartel emerged victorious, but at a cost blinded by the desire for dominance. Griselda Blanco had become a queen in a kingdom stained by betrayal, violence, and endless warfare. Griselda Blanco's smuggling routes were a carefully orchestrated web that spanned continents, an intricate network of pathways designed with precision to evade detection and defeat law enforcement. Each shipment was part of a master plan, a calculated risk that relied on secrecy, ingenuity, and, above all, speed. Blanco understood the importance of control. The flow of cocaine into the United States, particularly into Miami, was the lifeblood of her empire. The logistics were as vital to her as the product itself, and Blanco had built a system that was nearly impossible to crack. Her smuggling routes didn't just rely on traditional methods. They were a mixture of old-school methods and new-age ingenuity. Planes, boats, and trucks were all part of her fleet, moving the cocaine in a seamless operation that few even knew existed. Blanco's smuggling operation began with carefully chosen airstrips hidden in the jungles of Colombia. These covert landing zones, some little more than dirt tracks, were established in remote areas that had little to no oversight from authorities. From there, her network of loyal pilots would take off, often flying at night to avoid detection, delivering their loads to secret warehouses or hidden docks in Florida. Blanco knew the airspace like the back of her hand, understanding which flight paths were safest, which authorities could be bribed, and where the blind spots lay. She was always one step ahead, anticipating the law enforcement response before they even had a chance to act. Many of her early smuggling efforts relied on stealth, utilizing smaller planes to move drugs across borders without raising suspicion. The planes often carried false cargo furniture, produce, or innocuous goods, fooling customs and leaving law enforcement none the wiser. But it wasn't just air travel that kept her empire running. Blanco also relied heavily on boats, using them to bring large quantities of cocaine through the Caribbean. These boats were often disguised as legitimate commercial vessels, hauling everything from seafood to tropical fruits, making them nearly impossible to stop. Each boat had its own designated drop-off point along the Florida coast, and the cocaine would be transferred to waiting trucks that were part of a fleet designed for the task. Blanco's routes were fluid, changing when necessary, but always optimized for maximum efficiency and minimal exposure. Her success in staying off the radar of law enforcement was as much about the people she trusted as it was about her ability to remain invisible. Blanco had an extensive network of loyalists, smugglers, drivers, dock workers, and even officials, all of whom had a stake in her operations. Her ability to control these people, to keep her operations tight and discreet, allowed her to stay ahead of the authorities who were constantly breathing down her neck. Even when they did manage to intercept a shipment, it was usually only a small portion of what was in motion. Blanco's operations were too vast, too well disguised to stop completely. For years, Blanco managed to slip through the cracks, her smuggling routes so well established that law enforcement's efforts felt futile. She had built an empire based on the movement of cocaine, one that moved with terrifying efficiency. And yet, as skilled as she was, Blanco knew that the game could only go on for so long. The authorities were getting better at tracking shipments, and the walls were beginning to close in. Still, for a time, Blanco's smuggling network remained one of the most sophisticated operations in the world, leaving law enforcement scrambling to keep up with a woman who had mastered the art of the covert trade. Griselda Blanco's empire was built on loyalty, fear, and a network of associates whose roles were as varied as they were essential. It wasn't just the drugs that kept her empire running smoothly. It was the trust she placed in her inner circle. These were the people who worked in the shadows, the ones who made sure the cocaine moved, the cash flowed, and any potential betrayal was quickly snuffed out. Blanco's success wasn't just about her own ruthless ambition. It was about the unwavering loyalty of the men and women who made it all happen. Her circle was tight, but within it, each member had a specific role. At the top of this hierarchy were her most trusted lieutenants, individuals who knew the inner workings of her business as well as she did. Among them were seasoned smugglers who had made the same routes countless times, and hitmen who were always ready to execute Blanco's orders with precision. The hitmen, often referred to as sicarios, were trained to be ruthless and efficient, carrying out executions swiftly and without question. Blanco had a reputation for making enemies, and her sicarios were the ones who ensured her rivals stayed in line or disappeared altogether. They were her iron fist, and they didn't hesitate to strike when Blanco's command came. Blanco also relied heavily on her family. Her sons, who were too young to be directly involved in the operations at first, were still raised in the underworld atmosphere. She eventually brought them into the fold, showing them how the family business worked, though it was clear from the start that her dominance would never be questioned. In her eyes, family loyalty was paramount. Her closest confidants were like blood to her, and their roles often blended together: family, associates, and partners in crime. Then, there were the smugglers. They weren't just anyone who could drive a truck or pilot a plane. These were men and women who knew the ins and outs of the drug trade, people who understood the value of discretion, the importance of not drawing attention, and the art of smooth, efficient deliveries. Blanco's smuggling network was one of the best in the business, and it relied heavily on people who could slip through borders unnoticed, delivering cocaine into the United States without leaving a trace. Blanco had an almost maternal control over her inner circle. She took care of those she trusted, ensuring they were rewarded for their loyalty. Money flowed, protection was guaranteed, and status within the organization was carefully maintained. Yet, at the same time, she was quick to recognize any signs of disloyalty. She wasn't hesitant to eliminate anyone who stepped out of line, and the punishment for betrayal was swift and final. She knew that maintaining power meant controlling everyone around her with an iron grip. Her inner circle wasn't just a group of people who helped run a drug empire. They were part of her legacy. Blanco's success depended on them as much as it depended on her own strategic mind. The loyalty, fear, and trust they exhibited were the cornerstones of her reign. Together, they built an empire, and together, they ensured that no one ever questioned Blanco's authority. As Griselda Blanco's empire expanded, so did the shadows around her. The deeper her involvement in the drug trade, the more she realized that power, once attained, is fragile. For every deal struck, For every shipment that reached its destination, 1,000 eyes were watching, waiting for the moment of weakness. The higher she climbed, the more her paranoia seeped into every decision she made. Trust became a luxury she couldn't afford, and the walls of her world grew thicker, her circles smaller, and her actions more calculated. Blanco's paranoia wasn't just born from the risks of running a drug empire. It was ingrained in the lifestyle she had chosen. She knew that loyalty could be bought, but it could also be sold. And in the underworld, betrayal was just a matter of time. Every person who came into her orbit could either be an ally or a threat, and the difference was often indistinguishable until it was too late. So, she did what any true player of the game would do. She eliminated any uncertainty before it had a chance to take root. Blanco was meticulous in her efforts to protect herself. She surrounded herself with trusted men who could kill without hesitation. But she also took every precaution to ensure no one could get close enough to harm her. She never stayed in one place for too long. Homes were abandoned, safe houses rotated, and even her appearance changed regularly. If there was a chance of a raid, she had escape routes mapped out, and multiple ways of leaving a location should the need arise. Cars were switched out constantly, never allowing the authorities to trace her movements. Every step she took was planned, rehearsed, and ready to adapt to any situation that might present itself. Her paranoia also extended to her associates. Anyone could be a threat, and anyone could turn. Blanco's distrust permeated the organization. She would go to great lengths to test loyalty. A missed phone call, an unexpected delay, or a brief slip in behavior was all it took for her to suspect disloyalty. There were stories of people simply disappearing from her world, never to be seen again. She would eliminate any potential threat before it had a chance to harm her or her empire. Her methods were ruthless, nothing was left to chance. Blanco's paranoia wasn't just a defensive strategy, it was also a weapon. She used it to her advantage, creating a constant air of fear among her enemies and even her own crew. Everyone knew that crossing her could mean death. In the game she played, uncertainty was dangerous, and keeping everyone in line through fear was just as important as managing the drug routes. Even in her closest circles, there was always a sense that the hammer could drop at any moment. No one could be certain that their loyalty wouldn't be tested, and few would survive if they failed. As her power grew, so did her isolation. Blanco didn't just fear betrayal from her enemies, she feared it from her own. The very empire she had built was a testament to her strength and cunning, but in the quiet moments, it also served as a reminder of the danger she faced. Every decision was a gamble, and in the end, it wasn't just the threat from rival cartels she had to contend with, it was the relentless, gnawing fear that one day, the empire she'd built so carefully might unravel from the inside. Griselda Blanco lived a life of unmatched opulence, a reflection of the power she wielded and the empire she controlled. Her wealth, earned through blood and drugs, allowed her to indulge in every luxury imaginable, and she did so with a sense of both pride and defiance. As one of the most feared figures in the cocaine trade, she flaunted her riches, but always with an awareness of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface. Her homes were sprawling estates, opulent mansions that looked more like fortresses than residences. In Miami, she lived like royalty, her properties fitted with all the trimmings of excessive wealth. Marble floors, gold fixtures, and rooms full of fine art and expensive furniture. These were not just homes, they were symbols of her power. She spared no expense, surrounded by everything that reflected her rise from the slums of Colombia to the pinnacle of the drug world. The walls of her estates were lined with priceless treasures, but they also served as a reminder of the violent world that made them possible. She owned everything, and everyone, at least, that's how it seemed. Her wardrobe was another testament to her success. She draped herself in furs, jewelry, and designer clothes, her appearance as carefully curated as her criminal empire. But it wasn't just about looking wealthy, it was about asserting her status. Blanco wasn't just the queen of the cocaine trade. She was a queen in every sense of the word, with an air of authority that demanded respect wherever she went. Whether at a high-end restaurant or in the midst of a cocaine deal, her presence was unmistakable. Her sharp eyes, meticulously styled hair, and icy demeanor made it clear that she was a woman to be both admired and feared. But for all the luxury she surrounded herself with, the high life came with a price. Blanco's world was one of constant danger, a double-edged sword that glittered with wealth but cut with the threat of betrayal, violence, and law enforcement. As much as she enjoyed the fruits of her labor, she also understood that in her line of work, safety was fleeting. The same houses she built to reflect her empire were also fortified against the constant threat of enemies. Security was a 24/7 operation. No matter how lavish the surroundings, the fear of being watched, betrayed, or ambushed never left her. The high life came with high stakes. Her days of indulgence, however, were often overshadowed by the endless hustle of running her cocaine operations. For all her extravagance, Blanco's life was never truly her own. Behind the glamour, there was a tireless effort to stay ahead of the law, the competition, and the constant threat of violence. She might have enjoyed the finer things, but in the back of her mind, she knew that her empire was built on sand, and as much as she reveled in the wealth and luxury she'd earned, she also understood the fragility of it all. In her world, the high life was fleeting, and the price of enjoying it was paid in blood. Griselda Blanco's empire, built on trust, fear, and the unyielding loyalty of her associates, was brought to its knees by a single act of betrayal. The moment it happened, she must have known that the very thing she feared most had arrived, her own people turning against her. The weight of that betrayal was not just a personal affront, but a blow to the entire structure she had so meticulously constructed. It shattered everything she had built. Blanco had surrounded herself with loyal men and women, people she trusted implicitly, people who knew the price of crossing her. But loyalty, especially in the underworld, is often fleeting. Those who once owed everything to her, who had grown fat off her wealth, started to eye their own interests. They wanted more. Greed, insecurity, and fear of losing power crept into the hearts of those closest to her, and in the dark corners of her operations, whispers turned into plans. Griselda, who had lived by the knife's edge her entire life, now found herself sliced by the very people who once swore undying loyalty. It was a shift so subtle that Griselda likely didn't see it coming. She was a woman who had played the game better than anyone, yet in the end, it wasn't the law or the rivals that struck the fatal blow, it was the ones she trusted. A close associate, someone she had helped rise through the ranks, made a move that would set off a chain of events too powerful to stop. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with a gunshot or a bloodbath. Instead, it was calculated, quiet, and methodical. The kind of treachery that comes when someone knows the intimate workings of your operation, someone who knows exactly how to hit you where it hurts most. The informant's hand was hidden deep within Blanco's own circle, feeding information to law enforcement and rivals alike. What they didn't realize was that Griselda was no fool. She had seen people betray others before, and the instinct for survival, honed over years of navigating a dangerous world, kicked in. The act was exposed, and Blanco, ever the ruthless leader, responded with the kind of finality only she could. She had the traitor silenced. But by then, the damage was done. This betrayal set off a domino effect. Those around her, once unwavering in their loyalty, started to question their own futures. Would they be next? Could they trust anyone? The cracks in her empire grew wider, and the very people who once propelled her to the top now became the instruments of her downfall. The law enforcement heat had already been building, And now, with her organization crumbling from within, Blanco's downfall became inevitable. Her once indomitable rule weakened. The walls that had protected her for so long, built on fear and calculated violence, now began to collapse. Blanco, ever the queen of her world, found herself surrounded by betrayal. What was once hers, a kingdom of untold wealth and power, had turned into a battlefield where survival was a daily question. The fatal betrayal wasn't just the loss of her people, it was the beginning of the end for everything she had fought so hard to create. As Griselda Blanco's empire unraveled, law enforcement grew more determined than ever to bring her down. For years, Blanco had expertly evaded the grasp of the law, leaving a trail of bloodshed and chaos across Miami. But with the cracks in her empire widening and her betrayals mounting, the walls that once protected her began to close in. The pursuit was relentless, a cat-and-mouse game that Blanco had played with authority for too long. The authorities, including the DEA and FBI, were finally starting to understand the full extent of her operations. Blanco had ruled the streets of Miami with her cocaine empire, yet she had underestimated how far the law was willing to go to dismantle her kingdom. A woman once untouchable, feared by all, now found herself facing the very power she had manipulated for so long. The process wasn't simple. Blanco had earned her reputation for being ruthless, smart, and always a few steps ahead. She had learned to trust no one, and her ability to evade detection was unmatched. Her network of informants, loyalists, and corrupt officials had kept her one step ahead of the law, but the authorities were closing in. The investigation was exhaustive. It wasn't just about tracking her shipments anymore, it was about piecing together the intricate web of her operations, the lies, and the blood that ran through every transaction. The authorities were forced to use new tactics, infiltrating her circle of associates, intercepting phone calls, and tracking the very money that flowed through her hands. But Blanco was not easily captured. The authorities faced a challenge unlike any they had experienced before. Not only was Blanco elusive, but she also possessed a deep understanding of how law enforcement worked. Her empire, which had once been driven by violence and intimidation, had now become a machine of survival, with every move calculated to avoid detection. Blanco's paranoia only worked in her favor, pushing her to cover her tracks more carefully than ever. The authorities would often find themselves in the right place, but just a moment too late. Despite the obstacles, Blanco's days of freedom were numbered. Her ability to hide and manipulate events began to wane as law enforcement's resources grew. The relentless pressure was starting to take its toll. Her associates grew more paranoid and nervous, knowing the walls were closing in, and law enforcement was beginning to circle tighter with each passing day. Blanco knew it too. Every time the phone rang, every time a door creaked open, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment they would finally have her. She had built her empire on fear and violence, but now those very tools seemed insufficient against the inevitable force that was law enforcement. Blanco had spent years building a fortress around herself, but she couldn't stop the inevitable law enforcement was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before her reign ended. The battle between her and the authorities had become a personal one, a struggle for survival that would culminate in her eventual fall. The city that once feared her now had her on the run, and despite her cunning, it was only a matter of time before the law caught up. When Griselda Blanco was finally arrested, it wasn't just the fall of a woman, it was the collapse of an empire. Her reign, which had spanned years of bloodshed, manipulation, and corruption, was abruptly halted by the weight of law enforcement's relentless pursuit. For Blanco, the arrest was not just a loss of freedom, it was the shattering of everything she had built. The impact on her drug empire was immediate and devastating. Blanco had always operated with a sense of invincibility. She trusted no one, relied only on her sharp mind, and maintained an iron grip over her operations. Her empire had been one of the most formidable in the world, generating millions from the cocaine trade. Yet, even the most powerful criminals have their breaking points. For Blanco, that point came when law enforcement, led by the DEA, finally gathered enough evidence to secure her capture. It was a calculated move, and Blanco, who had once been untouchable, was now vulnerable. Her arrest was swift but impactful. It sent shockwaves through her network. The lieutenants, smugglers, and enforcers who had once served her with unquestioning loyalty now found themselves caught in the web of justice. Many saw it coming, but none were prepared for the scale of the collapse. Blanco's tight-knit circle of associates began to unravel. The fear of exposure, combined with the loss of their leader, caused chaos in the ranks. Her cartel, which had once moved shipments with ruthless precision, now floundered under the pressure of law enforcement. Without Blanco at the helm, the empire faltered. Rival cartels, once wary of Blanco's brutality, saw an opening to seize her territories. The streets of Miami, once ruled by Blanco's empire, became a battleground for control. Her vast network of routes, connections, and resources suddenly became fragmented. The dealers, once loyal to her, now had to navigate a world without the iron hand that had held them in check. Some went into hiding, others turned on one another. Blanco's arrest wasn't just the end of her, it was the beginning of the end for the empire she had built. For Blanco, the arrest represented more than just a loss of power. It was the end of her myth. She had gone from the cocaine godmother to a prisoner, her life now defined by the handcuffs that bound her wrists. The impact on her legacy was profound. Once feared, she was now a figure in a cell, waiting for the legal process to run its course. But even in her confinement, the legend of Griselda Blanco lived on. The empire may have crumbled, but the name Cocaine Godmother remained etched in the history of the drug trade. Blanco's arrest marked the collapse of an era, one defined by ambition, ruthlessness, and violence. Her empire was in ruins, but the echoes of her influence continued to reverberate in the world of drug trafficking. Griselda Blanco's trial was as much a spectacle as it was a grim reminder of the dangerous world she had once controlled. After her arrest, the eyes of the nation were firmly fixed on her, and what had once been a shadowy empire was now laid bare for all to see. The charges against her were numerous: murder, drug trafficking, conspiracy. But the weightiest of them all was the charge of orchestrating a vast network that had brought cocaine into the United States by the ton, flooding cities with death and destruction. Blanco's trial was nothing short of a high-stakes game, played out in the glare of media attention and in front of a jury that had already been swayed by the notorious reputation she had cultivated for herself. Blanco's defense was built on the foundation of doubt and denial. She denied any involvement in the murders, the drug trafficking, and the other illicit activities she had been accused of. Her lawyers painted her as a scapegoat, a woman wrongly accused of orchestrating a criminal empire that was the product of others' actions. They argued that Blanco had been framed by rival cartels, her success making her a target for those seeking to bring her down. It was an ambitious defense, but not one that had the strength to stand against the overwhelming evidence that had been carefully assembled over the years. As the trial progressed, more details of Blanco's empire came to light. Prosecutors presented testimony from former associates, many of whom had turned on her after her fall from grace. They spoke of the fear she had instilled in everyone around her, of the violence that had followed her wherever she went, and of the ruthless efficiency with which she had built her cocaine empire. The prosecution painted Blanco as a cold and calculating figure who had killed without hesitation and who had built her empire on the backs of the broken and the dead. But Blanco remained defiant. Even in the face of mounting evidence, she never wavered in her assertion that she was not the mastermind behind the empire that had made her infamous. Her defense strategy was to claim that the charges against her were exaggerated, that her role in the operations had been overstated, and that she was being made an example of by law enforcement desperate to bring her down. She knew that her reputation, one built on fear and manipulation, had preceded her, and she hoped to turn that very fear into a weapon, shifting the narrative to one of injustice. Despite her best efforts, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Her trial was a reminder that the life of a drug queenpin is often short-lived. As the verdict loomed closer, it was clear that the woman who had once ruled the streets of Miami with an iron fist would now face the full consequences of her actions. When the jury returned with its verdict, it was not surprising. Blanco was convicted on several charges, including drug trafficking, and was sentenced to prison. But even as the courtroom doors closed behind her, Griselda Blanco's legend remained unbowed, untamed, and as dangerous in death as she had been in life. The moment Griselda Blanco was sentenced to life in prison marked the end of an era for the cocaine trade. But it also sent shockwaves through the entire criminal world. She had once been untouchable, the undisputed queen of cocaine, with a network so vast and secretive that law enforcement had struggled to even scratch the surface of her empire. Yet, in the courtroom, her reign came to a grinding halt as the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blanco sat stoically, her face unreadable as the words echoed through the room. The shock wasn't just in the sentence itself, but in the reality that the woman who had ruled with fear, ruthlessness, and cunning was now facing the full weight of the law. Blanco's sentence was more than just a personal blow. It was a devastating signal to the drug world that even the most powerful and elusive players could eventually be caught and held accountable. Her conviction and sentencing were symbolic, a warning to those still in the business that no one was truly invincible. For years, Blanco had manipulated the law, bribed officials, and avoided capture through a combination of violence, strategy, and sheer audacity. Her empire had once seemed impenetrable, and for many, her arrest and trial felt like a moment of reckoning, proof that the authorities could, indeed, strike down the most powerful figures in the cocaine trade. Yet, even as she sat there, shackled and silent, Blanco's mind was always moving. Despite the defeat, she was already plotting, already thinking about the next move, the next angle. She knew that even behind bars, she would still have influence. Griselda had a unique ability to stay one step ahead, to pull strings from the shadows, and now, even though physically restrained, she would continue to exert her will through her network of loyalists. Her empire, though fractured, had left behind a trail of loyal allies, many of whom were willing to do anything to maintain the order she had created. Blanco understood that the game never ended, that survival in the criminal underworld was a matter of adapting and outwitting those who thought they had her cornered. The sentencing sent ripples through the Miami underworld, where Blanco's name still carried weight, even in her absence. The power vacuum she left behind was quickly filled by others, but none could rise to the same level of notoriety or control. Blanco had been a force of nature, and though her empire had crumbled, her legend remained alive in the streets, a constant reminder of what could be achieved through sheer willpower and ruthless ambition. Her sentence may have been the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of another one where Griselda Blanco, even in prison, would continue to cast her long shadow over the drug trade. Griselda Blanco's time in prison was supposed to be the end of her reign, the moment where her empire crumbled and her influence faded. But anyone who underestimated her tenacity made a grave mistake. Blanco's mind never stopped working, even behind bars. She quickly adapted to her new life in prison, using her intelligence and connections to maintain control over her empire from within the confines of a cell. Despite being physically locked away, Griselda continued to pull the strings of the drug trade like a puppet master, her name still a force to be reckoned with in the streets of Miami and beyond. Prison life was never easy for Blanco. She had a reputation to uphold, and she did so with a mix of cold indifference and ruthless efficiency. She wasn't the type to shrink from the harsh realities of prison life. Instead, she carved out a space for herself, negotiating, manipulating, and using her power to command respect from both inmates and prison guards alike. Though surrounded by the grim reality of her new environment, she was always calculating her next move, whether it was controlling the flow of money, maintaining her influence in the outside world, or ensuring that her loyalists stayed in line. Her ability to stay relevant was a testament to her shrewdness. Blanco was still in charge, still running things with a cold efficiency that no one could match. She maintained a web of communication with her associates, relaying orders through a series of carefully selected intermediaries. The smuggling routes she had once perfected remained operational, and even behind bars, she had a finger on the pulse of the cocaine trade. The same people who had once feared her now came to her for advice, paying her tribute from their profits and keeping her well informed of the state of her empire. Blanco's prison life was marked by an underlying sense of paranoia. She had built her empire on violence and loyalty, and in prison, she couldn't afford to relax her grip. Every conversation, every letter, every phone call was carefully orchestrated. She knew the walls of her prison cell could never fully contain her influence. Every day was a balancing act, ensuring her survival while keeping an eye on the new blood rising in the drug world. Those who sought to take what she had built. Her empire may have been fractured, but it was far from forgotten. Despite her influence, Blanco was no stranger to the mental toll of prison. Time moved slowly behind those bars, and the isolation she faced in confinement gnawed at her. Yet, she never let it break her. The woman who had risen from the streets, from nothing, had survived it all. And even from within the prison walls, Griselda Blanco remained untouchable, her reputation only growing stronger as the years went by. The fall of Griselda Blanco's empire was not swift, but it was inevitable. With Blanco behind bars, the vacuum of power she left in her wake was filled quickly by a mix of rival cartels and ambitious associates who saw the opening as an opportunity to expand their own influence. The empire she had built, one of immense wealth, violence, and control, began to fracture. As the years went by, the smuggling routes she had meticulously crafted became battlegrounds, with her former allies now at odds with one another, all fighting for control over the very network she had once commanded with an iron fist. The Miami cocaine wars, which had been so heavily influenced by Blanco's methods, continued. But without her to direct the operations, the chaos grew. Rival cartels, especially the Cali cartel and those with ties to the Mexican drug syndicates, capitalized on her absence. They moved in swiftly, picking apart her most profitable routes, siphoning off the lucrative trade that had once been solely under her command. They didn't just take her routes, they took her identity. The cocaine industry she had once ruled was now in the hands of others, and her name, once feared, began to lose its power as new players emerged. Her loyalists, those who had once carried out her orders with unwavering devotion, found themselves caught between the old regime and the new wave of drug lords. Some tried to hold on to the scraps of Blanco's empire, but the intricate web she had woven became increasingly difficult to maintain. The alliances she had built, founded on violence and fear, began to dissolve as her captains and lieutenants faced pressures from rival factions. The system she had built with calculated precision started to crumble under the weight of betrayal, shifting allegiances, and increasing law enforcement attention. Griselda Blanco's name still carried weight in certain circles, but with her empire gradually dismantled, she became more of a memory than a force to be reckoned with. The young bloods and newer players didn't fear her anymore. They saw her as a relic, a cautionary tale of what happens to those who live by violence and greed. Blanco's empire, which once spanned the globe, was now a shadow of its former self. The smuggling routes she had pioneered increasingly replaced by more modern, sophisticated operations. though Blanco herself remained a fixture in the stories of those who had once worked under her. The rise of new leaders and the changing dynamics of the drug trade left her empire in ruins. By the time she was released from prison, the world she had once ruled with such ferocity had long since moved on, and her attempts to regain control of what was left of her empire were met with indifference and hostility. Griselda Blanco, the once feared queen of cocaine, had been outpaced by the very industry she had helped create, and the remnants of her empire were left scattered across the wreckage of her downfall. Griselda Blanco's release from prison in the early 2000s was met with little fanfare, a stark contrast to the waves of fear and awe that had once accompanied her name. After spending nearly 2 decades behind bars, she was a woman aged by time, her face marked with the strain of years spent in confinement, but her mind still sharp, filled with memories of an empire she had once controlled. Her return to the outside world was less of a victory and more of a reluctant re-entry into a world that had moved on without her. The landscape of the drug trade had shifted, and her once dominant position in the cocaine business was now a distant memory, replaced by newer, more ruthless players. Blanco's attempts to reintegrate into the drug world were fraught with difficulty. The cartels she had once commanded or controlled had long since evolved. The routes she had meticulously built were now under the sway of others, and her old allies had either been incarcerated, killed, or moved on to different ventures. The power that had once flowed through her veins was now a shadow. Still, she wasn't ready to let go. Blanco, always the survivor, sought ways to rebuild, trying to tap into the underground economy she had once controlled with such precision. She found that the new players in the game were reluctant to welcome her back. The street-savvy young cartel members saw her as an old relic, someone to be ignored or, at best, used as a footnote in the new history of the drug trade. They weren't interested in her old methods of violence and intimidation. They had learned that control in the modern world required subtlety, not just brute force. Blanco, however, refused to fade into obscurity. She tried to re-establish connections, to rekindle old relationships, but each attempt felt more like a fading echo. The cocaine empire she had built in the 70s and 80s no longer had the same allure or influence. In her solitude, Blanco faced the harsh truth. Her time had passed. She no longer had the same grip on the drug trade, and her name carried more weight in the annals of history than in the streets of Miami or Colombia. The younger generation that had once revered her as a queenpin now viewed her as a cautionary tale. Her attempts to regain control were limited, and she realized that the cartel wars she had once fought were no longer hers to fight. Blanco's reintegration into the drug world was short-lived. Despite her attempts to reconnect with old associates and re-establish smuggling routes, the world she had once dominated was beyond her grasp. The networks she had once manipulated with ease were now more complex, controlled by others. The godmother of cocaine was no longer a queen, but a figure from the past, attempting to adapt to a world that had already moved on without her. Life after prison was a harsh adjustment for Griselda Blanco, a woman who had once been a queenpin at the heart of a vast drug empire. Stepping back into the world she had helped shape felt like a lifetime ago. The landscape had shifted while she had been behind bars. The cocaine trade had evolved, its operations growing more sophisticated, its players younger and less willing to show respect for the woman who had once ruled it all. Blanco, however, never gave up on her drive to regain her place at the top. Her release was a moment of freedom, but not one filled with celebration. Blanco found herself thrust into a world that barely remembered the power she had once wielded. The streets of Miami had grown quieter. The loud violence that had marked her empire's rise was now absent, replaced by the quiet maneuverings of rival cartels who had learned how to navigate the drug business without drawing the same attention. Blanco's methods, brutal and efficient, had been replaced by subtler forms of manipulation, and she found herself irrelevant in a world that no longer operated in the way she had known. Her name still carried weight, but it was a weight of myth rather than influence. Blanco's attempts to make her mark once again were met with skepticism. The younger drug lords and dealers had their own codes, their own networks, and they had little use for Blanco's violent, no-nonsense approach. She was a relic, a ghost of a time when things were done with fear and power. Blanco sought to make inroads, offering her expertise to those who might be willing to listen. But the doors she once had opened with a smile and a threat were now closed to her. She found herself increasingly isolated, unable to regain the trust of the people she once controlled. Yet Blanco wasn't one to accept defeat easily. She sought out new ways to enter the game, trying to tap into old connections, but they were few and far between. Her sons, once the core of her empire, had either turned against her or disappeared into their own lives. The world had moved on, leaving her behind. Blanco became more desperate as the reality of her situation set in. She wasn't going to regain her power the way she had before. The cocaine trade had gone underground, and the violence she had once relied upon no longer seemed to have a place. In the solitude of her later years, Blanco reflected on the empire she had built and lost. She was still Griselda Blanco, the godmother of cocaine, but her influence had been reduced to a name that evoked fear and fascination, not power. She lived in a world where her past was nothing more than a story told in whispers, and the future was one she couldn't control. Adjusting to a world that had moved without her was something Blanco could never fully accept. The years in prison had taken more from her than just her freedom. They had stolen her place in a world she had helped create. Even after her release from prison, Griselda Blanco's reputation lingered like a dark cloud over the drug world. The fear she had instilled during her reign as the cocaine godmother never truly dissipated. Though her empire had crumbled and her influence had waned, the myth of Griselda Blanco remained. The mere mention of her name still carried weight, and in certain circles, it invoked a sense of dread. She was no longer the active player she once had been, but she had left behind a legacy that people feared to challenge. Her reputation had been built on years of ruthless actions, brutal tactics, and a cold efficiency that left no room for weakness. Blanco's reign had been marked by bloody wars with rival cartels, public executions, and a total disregard for human life. Her power had been undeniable at its peak, and even though she no longer commanded an empire, the world she had ruled still trembled at the thought of her return. Those who had once been part of her inner circle, her trusted lieutenants and hitmen, now lived in constant fear of her wrath. She was no longer actively pulling the strings, but there was a lingering threat that she could, at any moment, reassert control and exact vengeance on anyone who had wronged her. Even in her quieter years after prison, Blanco still had a way of making people uneasy. Old associates were wary of crossing her, even though they knew she no longer held the same level of influence. She became a figure that people spoke of in hushed tones, like a shadow from the past that was never far behind. There were rumors that Blanco had managed to re-establish some of her old connections, but they remained just that, rumors. Despite her attempts to regain her footing in the drug world, it was clear that Blanco's time as a kingpin had passed. Yet, she was still feared, and that fear still gave her some measure of power. Her legacy was a double-edged sword. It had made her both a legend and a cautionary tale. For some, she was the embodiment of the dangers of ambition and power. For others, she was the very personification of survival in a ruthless world. Even after she had faded from the front lines of the drug trade, Blanco's name carried the weight of her past actions, and the fear of retribution for those who crossed her never truly went away. Blanco may have lost her empire, but she had never lost the ability to instill fear in those who had once feared her. The reign of fear, though quiet now, still lingered in the minds of those who remembered the power she had held and the terror that had once followed in her wake. Griselda Blanco's legacy is one woven with contradictions. She was a woman whose ambition and ruthlessness transformed her into one of the most influential figures in the world of narcotics. Her rise from the slums of Colombia to the heights of cocaine power in Miami marked a turning point in the drug trade, shaping the cartel-driven world of the 1970s and 1980s. Blanco didn't just build a criminal empire. She redefined what it meant to be a female boss in a male-dominated world, shattering expectations and asserting her dominance with a mix of cunning, fear, and violence. Her notoriety is rooted in the sheer scale of her operations. Blanco is often credited with pioneering the use of established smuggling routes and developing networks that would later become integral to the cocaine trade. She was not only a trafficker, she was a businesswoman, a strategist who managed to carve a path for herself in a field filled with rivals and danger. Through her savvy use of shipping routes, airplanes, and intricate distribution networks, Blanco moved enormous quantities of cocaine, earning her the title, the Queen of Cocaine. But Blanco's legacy is not simply one of business acumen, it's also marked by bloodshed and brutality. She had no qualms about using extreme violence to maintain control, silencing threats with terrifying efficiency. Her personal ruthlessness became legendary, as she used intimidation, manipulation, and murder to eliminate anyone who might betray her or challenge her position. The violent wars she waged against rival cartels, and the terror she instilled in both her enemies and allies alike, made her a figure feared and respected in equal measure. As much as Blanco's empire crumbled after her arrest and imprisonment, her impact on the drug trade cannot be understated. She was a key figure in the rise of the Medellin and Cali cartels, helping shape the global cocaine market and influencing the patterns of trafficking that would persist long after her fall from grace. Her operations, methods, and sheer audacity set the stage for future drug lords to rise to power, and her name became synonymous with both the heights of cocaine fortune and the depths of its dangers. Yet, Blanco's legacy is also complicated by the very nature of her downfall. As her power waned, so did her ability to control her empire. Betrayals and the erosion of her once untouchable reputation exposed the fragility of the world she had built. But even in the face of diminishing influence, she remained a figure who continued to haunt the drug world. Her ability to stay relevant, even in her later years, despite her incarceration, attests to her unyielding nature and the enduring fear she inspired. Blanco's name may not carry the same weight it once did in the criminal underworld, but the indelible mark she left on the history of drug trafficking is undeniable. She was, for better or worse, a force of nature, a woman whose ambition, violence, and strategic genius made her a legend, and whose legacy will always be a part of the shadowy world she once ruled. Griselda Blanco's influence on the drug trade extended far beyond her reign as a powerful figure in the 1970s and 1980s. Her tactics, business strategies, and unapologetic ruthlessness helped shape the very framework of the modern narcotics industry, laying the groundwork for the cartels that followed. While Blanco's empire eventually crumbled, her methods left an indelible mark on the world of drug trafficking, leaving a legacy that would be echoed in the operations of future drug lords and cartels. One of Blanco's most significant contributions to the drug trade was her ability to turn logistics into a finely tuned operation. At the height of her power, Blanco had an intricate network of smuggling routes that spanned across the globe, utilizing airplanes, boats, and tunnels to transport cocaine from Colombia to the United States. She revolutionized the concept of cocaine cowboys by turning drug trafficking into a well-oiled machine, allowing her to move large quantities of cocaine with efficiency and speed. Future cartels would adopt her use of planes and other hidden methods of transport, taking the lessons from Blanco's empire and refining them for their own purposes. Blanco's aggressive expansion of drug routes also set the stage for the dominance of cocaine in the American market. She had the foresight to create relationships with key players in the industry, establishing alliances with other cartels that would ensure her access to distribution networks and avoid competition. She knew that control of the supply chain was as crucial as the product itself. Her ability to forge these vital connections inspired future generations of drug traffickers, who also understood that cooperation and connections could make or break their success. Perhaps Blanco's most significant and lasting influence on the drug trade was her ruthless tactics. Her use of violence to eliminate rivals and enforce loyalty was legendary. She set a precedent for how cartels would handle betrayal, ensuring that anyone who crossed her would be met with deadly force. This fear-based system of control became a model for other cartels, including the Medellin and Cali cartels, who followed her example in using fear and intimidation to maintain their power. Blanco's willingness to kill without hesitation became a hallmark of the cocaine trade, influencing the brutal tactics of future drug lords. Blanco's ability to remain an influential figure, even as her empire began to falter, further solidified her place in the history of drug trafficking. Despite being arrested and imprisoned, her name remained synonymous with power in the drug world, and she continued to influence operations from behind bars. Her methods continued to reverberate through the cartels that arose after her, as her strategic brilliance, ruthless control, and unyielding determination served as a blueprint for the next wave of drug cartels. In the end, Blanco's influence on the modern drug trade was profound. From her mastery of logistics to her strategic alliances and brutal tactics, she helped shape the future of narcotics trafficking in ways that continue to impact the industry today. Even after her downfall, the world she created still lingers, a testament to her lasting impact on the drug world. Griselda Blanco's ascent to power in the male-dominated world of drug trafficking marked a significant turning point in the history of organized crime. While female figures in the drug trade were rare, Blanco's success paved the way for future generations of women to break into and thrive in this ruthless industry. She became not just a criminal mastermind, but a symbol of strength, power, and resilience. For women in the underworld, Blanco's rise to the top served as a blueprint for success, showing that women could not only participate in the drug trade, but could dominate it. Her influence was transformative, as Blanco's methods were both practical and terrifying. Her ability to create vast smuggling networks, secure relationships with powerful figures, and employ violent tactics to maintain control were all hallmarks of a successful drug lord. Yet what set her apart was her gender, which became as much a part of her identity as her operations. Blanco navigated the predominantly male world with a mix of cunning, aggression, and calculated intimidation. She shattered stereotypes and proved that women could wield the same level of influence and brutality as any man in the trade. Her ability to command loyalty and strike fear into rivals earned her respect, not just from male traffickers but also from women seeking to make their mark in the same world. Blanco's rise created a ripple effect throughout the underworld, particularly among women. She became a role model for aspiring female drug lords, a symbol that the glass ceiling in the world of crime could be shattered. Women who once viewed the drug trade as a man's world began to see themselves in Blanco's shoes. They saw how she had used her intelligence, her ruthlessness, and her ability to control the most violent factions of the drug world to achieve unparalleled success. For many, Blanco's name was synonymous with power and independence, and her example gave them the courage to step out from the shadows and take control of their own criminal enterprises. Her impact was particularly profound in Latin America, where the drug trade was integral to the economy and culture. Blanco's ability to not only thrive but dominate in such an environment was revolutionary. Women, who had been relegated to secondary roles in drug cartels, began to take on more prominent leadership positions, often emulating Blanco's business strategies and violent approach to handling rivals. While the rise of female drug lords did not eradicate the risks and challenges of the profession, it gave women a tangible figure to aspire to, someone who had defied the odds and risen to the top of an unforgiving industry. Blanco's legacy as a pioneering female drug lord remains undeniable. Though her empire ultimately crumbled, her story continues to inspire those who seek power in the criminal world. She showed that being a woman in the drug trade wasn't a limitation, but an opportunity to rise above and make a name in the most dangerous arena. Griselda Blanco was a force to be reckoned with, and her influence has lasted far beyond her time. Griselda Blanco's children were born into a world of power, wealth, and danger, their lives inevitably intertwined with the very empire their mother built. From an early age, they were exposed to the brutality of the drug trade, growing up with the constant presence of violence, wealth, and the looming shadow of law enforcement. Despite their mother's attempts to shelter them, the allure of the empire she had created, along with the ties to the criminal underworld, eventually pulled them in, leading to tragic and fatal consequences. Blanco's eldest son, Michael Corleone Blanco, was the first to become deeply involved in the family business. Despite the violent history surrounding his mother, he initially seemed reluctant to join the drug trade. Yet, as time passed, he became more entangled in the world of smuggling, following the footsteps of his mother's empire. Michael's involvement in the cartel was marked by the same mix of cunning and ruthlessness that had characterized Blanco's rise. However, unlike his mother, who was feared and respected, Michael's attempts to lead were overshadowed by the damage done to the family's name and reputation. The cartel, which had once been a dominant force in the cocaine trade, was now crumbling, with rivals and law enforcement alike closing in. As the years passed, the tragic fate of Blanco's children became increasingly apparent. In the early 2000s, Michael was targeted by rivals in the drug world, leaving him struggling to regain control of any semblance of the empire his mother once ruled. The constant threat of death, coupled with his family's past, left him vulnerable to both enemies and the law. His life ended in violence, a tragic reflection of the world his mother had created for him, a world where the cost of loyalty and betrayal was often paid with blood. Blanco's other sons, who had witnessed their mother's rise and fall, were also caught in the web of the drug trade. Her youngest son, who was at the center of the family's life in the 1980s, also met a violent end, just like his mother's enemies. Their tragic fates were a direct result of the power Blanco had amassed, but also the volatile, unforgiving world she had led them into. Her children, once given everything they could ever dream of, had no choice but to navigate the treacherous waters of the drug business, ultimately losing their lives to the same empire that had once promised them everything. The downfall of Blanco's children was not just a tragic reflection of the dangers of the drug trade, but also a testament to the cyclical nature of violence and crime. Blanco's ambition had ensured that her empire was built on bloodshed and fear, but it was her own children who would pay the ultimate price for the empire she left behind. The legacy of power she had created only served to further entrap those closest to her, and her children's tragic fates were a final reminder of the heavy toll that comes with living a life built on crime. Griselda Blanco's empire was built on loyalty, yet within the walls of her criminal world, loyalty was often as fragile as the bonds that tied them together. Her relationship with her sons, Michael and the others, was steeped in complexity, as love and trust became blurred with the violent and unforgiving demands of the drug trade. She raised them with an iron fist, ensuring they understood the ways of survival in a world that demanded ruthless allegiance to the family. But while Blanco demanded unwavering loyalty from her inner circle, she struggled with the balance of nurturing and controlling her sons. Her eldest son, Michael, was often seen as the heir to her empire, the one who would carry on her legacy. But despite his involvement in the family business, he could never escape the shadow of his mother. He was torn between his desire to step out of Blanco's formidable presence and the obligation to continue what she had built. As he sought to make his own name in the drug world, the pressures of his family's past and the ruthless nature of the business caused cracks in their relationship. Michael found himself caught in the constant tug-of-war between loyalty to his mother's empire and the need to forge his own path. This conflict played out in his actions, both within the family and against its enemies, as he wrestled with what loyalty truly meant when it came to Blanco. Blanco, in turn, had her own struggles with loyalty. While she demanded absolute trust from those closest to her, her own paranoia began to chip away at the once unbreakable bonds. Trust, for Griselda, was a commodity to be earned, and often, the cost was the ultimate betrayal. Her associates were no different. They were either family or enemies, and the lines between the two were often blurred. Blanco was known for her ability to manipulate those around her, but even her closest allies were not immune to the game of loyalty and betrayal she so masterfully played. As Blanco's empire crumbled under pressure from law enforcement, rival cartels, and internal betrayal, her relationship with her sons became even more strained. Michael's attempts to carve out his own identity were overshadowed by the violence of the world Griselda had introduced him to. While she may have believed that her son would inherit her empire, the cracks in their relationship grew wider, as both of them fought against the ties that bound them to a past of bloodshed and fear. Griselda's attempts to control the lives of those closest to her only deepened the betrayals within her inner circle, leaving her isolated in her final days. The ties that bind family together are often tested by the brutal realities of loyalty in a world where betrayal is commonplace. For Blanco and her sons, those bonds were shattered by the weight of their past, leaving them to grapple with the cost of the empire she had built and the devastating impact it had on those who once called her family. In the end, the loyalty Griselda demanded from others was something she could never fully possess herself. Griselda Blanco's story resonated far beyond her own rise and fall. While she was undeniably a product of her time, a ruthless figure carved from the same darkness that consumed the men around her, her legacy would pave the way for future generations of women to step into a world they had once been excluded from. Blanco's rise in the drug trade wasn't just about the wealth or power she amassed. It was the way she did it. She fought tooth and nail to carve her name into the annals of history, showing the world that a woman, if ruthless enough, could hold the same authority and instill the same fear as any kingpin. It was this defiance, this breaking of gender norms in the world of drug trafficking, that would go on to inspire a new wave of women in the business. Her story was one of both admiration and warning, a cautionary tale told within the underworld of powerful women who, like Blanco, sought control in a space traditionally dominated by men. Her tactics, cunning and ruthless, provided a blueprint that many would follow. Just as she had once learned from the male leaders of her time, future women would learn from her methods, smuggling techniques, building vast networks of informants, and establishing fiercely loyal supporters who would be willing to fight and die to defend the empire. They would take her lessons and adapt them to fit their own ambitions, a rising tide of powerful women who were no longer confined to the sidelines. Her legacy, though marred by violence and the eventual collapse of her empire, ignited something in the next generation of women who saw an opportunity to step into the role Blanco had once held. Whether in Colombia, Mexico, or beyond, new figures began to emerge, women who were ready to take on the drug trade and claim the same power and respect that Blanco had earned. They mirrored her ability to manipulate, control, and impose fear with the same icy resolve, all while challenging the deeply entrenched belief that women couldn't hold the same power in such a cutthroat, violent industry. One of the most powerful aspects of Blanco's legacy was the idea that women, too, could be feared and revered. Her fierce tenacity, her ability to strike quickly, and her complete lack of hesitation when it came to killing made her a force to be reckoned with. As the years passed, Her legacy became a beacon for those who refused to let society's traditional gender roles dictate their future. The women who came after her built their empires on the foundation she'd laid, even if it was one paved with blood and betrayal. Though Griselda Blanco was long gone, the generations of women who followed her would continue to walk the path she forged. The new cocaine godmother was born from her influence, and with her rise, the underworld would never be the same again. She had proven that the world of drug lords wasn't just for men. She had made sure that, in the end, women could rule it too. Even behind bars, Griselda Blanco's influence didn't wane. In fact, for some, her imprisonment only served to cement her legend, making her an even more elusive figure. The prison walls that held her were nothing but a physical limitation, one she quickly adapted to, finding ways to continue manipulating the drug world from within. It was a deadly game, one that Blanco played with the same ruthlessness she had in her prime, and her reach extended far beyond the confines of her cell. While the authorities believed they had contained her, they underestimated the power of fear and the respect she commanded, both from her former associates and those still loyal to her. Blanco maintained a tight grip on her operations through intermediaries, constantly orchestrating the drug trade from behind bars with an unyielding hand. She used a network of trusted allies, including her sons, to relay orders, carry out hits, and continue smuggling operations. Her capacity for manipulation hadn't dulled in the slightest. She had learned long ago that control didn't always need to be physical. It could be mental, emotional, and strategic. Even from a cell, she remained a puppeteer, pulling strings in the shadows of the criminal underworld, leaving her enemies terrified of the consequences of crossing her. Her ruthless nature never faltered. Blanco was notorious for instilling fear in even the most hardened criminals, and that fear followed her into prison. She wasn't just the head of an empire. She was a living, breathing symbol of power and violence. She had earned her position not just by force, but through the calculated manipulation of everyone around her. She played the deadly game of betrayal and survival with ease, knowing exactly when to make her move and how to cover her tracks. Despite her incarceration, she continued to orchestrate hits, eliminate threats, and control drug routes as though nothing had changed. Her reputation alone was enough to make even the most powerful men in the drug trade tremble at the thought of crossing her. Blanco's name was spoken in whispers, always laced with fear, and even her absence from the streets only served to deepen the myth around her. She remained a looming figure in the minds of those who feared her wrath, knowing that her reach extended far beyond the walls of her prison. She was a master of intimidation, a shadowy presence that haunted the operations she once controlled, her influence lingering in every corner of the business she built. Blanco's imprisonment had not ended her empire. Instead, it had transformed it into something darker, more insidious. Her deadly game continued to play out in the underworld, with every move carefully orchestrated from a distance. She was a queen in exile, ruling from her cell, proving once again that no matter where she was, Griselda Blanco was never truly out of the game. Even after Griselda Blanco's fall from power, the Miami cocaine trade continued to flourish, largely due to the foundations she had laid during her reign. Blanco's cartel had been a well-oiled machine, with operations running through every inch of Miami, feeding the insatiable demand for cocaine. Though her empire was dismantled by law enforcement, her methods, her networks, and her ruthless efficiency lived on in the streets she once ruled. Blanco had built the infrastructure, establishing smuggling routes, connections, and a network of loyalists that would continue to function long after she was imprisoned. Cartel didn't just disappear with her arrest, it transformed. In the void she left, new players emerged, but they were guided by the tactics Blanco had perfected. The cocaine trade in Miami had been refined under her rule, and even in her absence, the power structures she had erected persisted. Rival cartels, recognizing the effectiveness of Blanco's strategies, adapted them to their own operations, ensuring that the cocaine economy in Miami remained a booming, lucrative enterprise. The networks she created were not just about drug trafficking. They involved the transportation of large quantities of cocaine, laundering the profits, and maintaining a culture of violence that kept competitors at bay. Blanco's influence was evident in the way her operations had become a blueprint for future cartel activities, not just in Miami but across the U.S. Her use of a decentralized operation, where many smaller, independently operated cells worked together under a unified command, allowed for continuity after her capture. Even as her name faded from the headlines, the methods she implemented ensured that her impact on the cocaine trade was deeply ingrained in the fabric of the industry. The Miami cartel legacy also manifested in the power vacuum that followed her downfall. While Blanco had been a dominant force, her absence allowed for the rise of other figures in the drug trade who sought to fill her shoes. These new players, often ruthless and hungry for control, adopted Blanco's model of intimidation, loyalty, and violence, ensuring the streets of Miami remained battlegrounds for the drug lords who would come after her. The underground world she once controlled was built on her vision, and her cartel's influence would be felt for years, creating a foundation for future narco-traffickers to build upon. Even as the law closed in on her and her empire crumbled, the ripples of Blanco's cartel continued to shape the landscape of Miami's drug trade. The blueprint she left behind in the form of smuggling routes, distribution networks, and terror tactics became a legacy for those who followed. Ensuring that Blanco's empire never truly disappeared, it only evolved into something more dangerous. Griselda Blanco and her cartel have left a lasting imprint on pop culture, transforming from figures of fear and power to icons of criminal infamy. Over the years, her story has been immortalized in a variety of media, from documentaries to feature films, reflecting the complex and dangerous world she once ruled. Blanco's rise from poverty to becoming one of the most influential drug lords in history has captivated audiences, often glorifying the ruthlessness and cunning that defined her. Her life, full of betrayal, violence, and ambition, became the subject of films like Cocaine Godmother, where actresses like Catherine Zeta-Jones portrayed Blanco's steely demeanor and her relentless rise to power. Her cartel's operations smuggling cocaine into the United States with surgical precision and establishing an empire in Miami have become the stuff of cinematic legend. These portrayals often highlight the tension, the terror, and the high-stakes game Blanco played, where power was built on bloodshed and loyalty was maintained through fear. These media adaptations have done more than just tell Blanco's story. They have romanticized the criminal underworld, making her an anti-heroine for some, while also underscoring the violence and destruction that such a life inevitably brought. Beyond films, Blanco's impact can be seen in numerous documentaries and books, where her legacy as the cocaine godmother has been dissected in great detail. Her involvement in the infamous Miami drug wars, the tactical genius behind her smuggling operations, and the sheer ruthlessness with which she maintained control of her empire have become textbook examples of the deadly intersection between power, greed, and crime. Authors and filmmakers have found inspiration in her story, weaving narratives that often explore the psychology of a woman who rose from obscurity to become a symbol of terror and power in the criminal world. Blanco's story is not just a tale of one woman's criminal enterprise. It is a reflection of a larger cultural fascination with the world of drugs, cartels, and organized crime. The media's portrayal of Blanco and her cartel taps into a certain rebellious allure, glorifying the power they wielded, while subtly romanticizing their audacity and fearlessness. Even as the law dismantled her empire, Blanco's myth continued to grow, fueled by the media's portrayal of her as a larger-than-life figure. However, these portrayals are not without controversy. Many critics argue that glorifying figures like Blanco distorts the brutal realities of the drug trade, which devastated countless lives. Yet, Blanco's continued presence in pop culture speaks to a darker fascination, a fascination that not only romanticizes her criminal empire, but also serves as a reflection of society's ongoing obsession with power, rebellion, and the consequences of living on the edge. Griselda Blanco's life has become a tangled web of myth and reality, with the lines often blurred between the woman who built an empire and the legend that has come to define her. As her story spread through media and pop culture, myths began to form around her persona, myths that both elevated her as an almost untouchable figure and simplified the violent truth of her actions. Many saw her as a powerful, fearless woman who defied the norms of a male-dominated world, a queenpin who orchestrated one of the most profitable and ruthless criminal enterprises in history. These narratives often painted Blanco as a master strategist, a cold-blooded leader whose name instilled fear but also commanded respect. Her sharp intelligence and ability to manipulate situations made her a figure to be admired in certain circles, as she outwitted law enforcement, rival cartels, and anyone who stood in her way. However, behind the myths lay a much harsher reality. The truth of Blanco's reign was marked not by elegance, but by brutal violence and relentless power. Her empire was built on bloodshed, with Blanco orchestrating countless murders to maintain control over her territory. She was known for eliminating anyone she saw as a threat, often with no hesitation and no remorse. The women who were drawn into her world were often as cold and ruthless as the men, but Blanco's ability to remain untouchable in the face of law enforcement and competition was not simply due to her sharp mind. It was also due to her willingness to make sacrifices and commit atrocities that many others wouldn't dare. Her ruthlessness extended beyond just her professional dealings. It seeped into her personal life as well. Blanco's family, particularly her sons, were pulled into the web of the drug trade, often playing key roles in her operations. But her relationships were complicated by violence and betrayal, as those closest to her sometimes fell victim to the same ruthlessness that defined her reign. Even as she enjoyed luxury and power, the harsh reality was that her empire was never secure, and the constant fear of betrayal loomed over her every decision. It was a life of constant paranoia, where loyalty was as fragile as the cocaine shipments she smuggled. The myth of Blanco as a criminal mastermind has persisted, but it often ignores the toll her actions took on those around her. While she may have been seen as a fierce, unapologetic figure, the reality was that her rise to power was anything but glamorous. Her empire crumbled in the same violent fashion it was built, and her legacy is one not just of dominance, but of destruction. The myths surrounding her life may have painted a picture of a powerful queen, but the truth was that she was a woman who lived in constant fear and used violence as her greatest weapon. The myth, it seems, will always outshine the reality, but the truth remains far darker. The final betrayal that led to Griselda Blanco's downfall was not just the result of law enforcement closing in on her empire, but a devastating treachery from within her inner circle. For years, Blanco had relied on the loyalty of her closest associates, those who helped her build the cocaine empire that stretched across Miami and beyond. She had trusted them with her life, but as her power began to wane and the heat from law enforcement intensified, cracks began to form in her network. Her paranoia had grown to staggering levels, but even her sharpened instincts couldn't protect her from the one thing she feared most: betrayal. It wasn't a rival cartel or a government agent who finally set her empire into motion for collapse. It was a betrayal from one of her own, an associate who, driven by fear or greed, made the decision to turn on her. As Blanco became more desperate to maintain her grip on power, her distrust grew, but by then, it was too late. The traitor knew just how to exploit Blanco's weaknesses and played on her fears. In a world where loyalty was the most valuable currency, the betrayal was the most dangerous weapon. Blanco, ever the strategist, attempted to handle the threat with the same ruthless precision she had used to eliminate rivals. But this time, her methods failed her. She wasn't able to quell the tide of disloyalty quickly enough, and the betrayal became a spark that ignited the eventual unraveling of her empire. As law enforcement closed in, supported by information passed on by her own people, Blanco found herself facing the walls closing in from all sides. Her power, once unshakable, had faltered, and now she was alone. In those final days, Blanco fought to maintain her position. She tried to escape, to hide from those who wanted her brought down, but there was no place left for her to run. Even her elaborate smuggling routes, once her lifeblood, had been compromised. The same empire she had built with such care and fear now turned against her, and all her violent measures to keep it intact couldn't undo the damage. The very people she had once trusted, who had helped her rise to the pinnacle of power, were now the ones pulling the strings to bring her down. Griselda Blanco, the cocaine godmother, had seen countless enemies fall before her, but in the end, it wasn't a bullet or a prison cell that toppled her. It was the weight of betrayal, a betrayal she couldn't control, a betrayal that severed her from everything she had built. She had spent her life crafting a kingdom based on fear, manipulation, and control, but in the end, it was the loss of loyalty, the thread that held everything together, that proved to be her undoing. Griselda Blanco had spent the better part of her life in the shadows, and as the walls began to close in around her, she knew there was no easy escape. The very empire she had built, with all its layers of secrecy and violence, had become her prison. Once a queen of the cocaine trade, feared and admired by many, Blanco's time in the spotlight had become a nightmare. Law enforcement was closing in, and her enemies, both old and new, were more determined than ever to bring her down. But even as the pressure mounted, Blanco refused to surrender. She had spent decades in control, playing the game with calculated moves, and now she would try to play it one last time. Blanco's efforts to escape the shadows of her past weren't just about evading capture, but about trying to outrun the ghosts of the decisions she had made. Every betrayal, every violent act, every life she had destroyed, these were the shadows that clung to her. She had tried to disappear once before, but the authorities and her enemies had a way of finding her, no matter how much she hid. This time, she would be more careful. She would change her appearance, switch locations frequently, and rely on the networks she had spent so many years cultivating. But the game had changed. The laws of the world she once ruled no longer applied. The same smuggling routes she had once mastered were now compromised, and the web of informants she had trusted was no longer loyal. Despite the odds stacked against her, Blanco still believed she could outwit everyone. She tried to use her old tactics, slipping between the cracks, staying a step ahead. She would disappear for days, moving between safe houses, trusting only a small circle of people who knew how to keep her hidden. Yet, even in her attempts to disappear, Blanco couldn't escape the truth. Her past was a constant reminder, a specter that haunted her every move. She could hide, but she could never truly outrun the life she had created. And as law enforcement tightened its grip, Blanco realized that no matter how carefully she moved, the shadow of her own empire would eventually catch up to her. Blanco's escape was not just physical, but emotional. The woman who had once controlled everything, feared by all, now found herself looking over her shoulder at every turn. Every time a car passed too slowly, every time a door creaked open, she feared it was the end. She had once thrived in the danger, the thrill of the game. But now, it was a constant weight she couldn't shake. The life she had built had turned against her, and now she was just another fugitive, running from her own legacy. She had spent her life in the shadows, but in the end, it was the light of her past that she couldn't escape. Griselda Blanco's death came quietly, almost unnoticed. in the same shadows she had spent her life weaving in and out of. By then, she was a woman far removed from the cocaine empire she had once ruled with an iron fist. The notorious cocaine godmother had fallen from her peak, and the drug world had evolved in ways she couldn't control. After years of evading the law, surviving betrayals, and facing the constant threat of death, her final moments seemed almost anticlimactic. It was as if the world had already moved on, and her passing was just one last ripple in the dark waters of her legacy. Blanco died in September 2012, shot in the head while leaving a butcher shop in Medellin, Colombia, where she had lived in relative obscurity since her return to the country after serving her prison sentence in the United States. At the time, the streets that had once echoed with her power were now filled with other names, other cartels. Yet, her death remained shrouded in mystery, with little clarity on who was responsible or why her life had been cut short. Some say it was the result of old enemies, perhaps a hit ordered by those who had once feared and respected her. Others believe her death was a consequence of the very network she had built, with the shifting allegiances and new power structures in the drug world now closing in on her. The fact that she was murdered in such a casual, almost public way, only deepened the intrigue surrounding her death. The woman who had orchestrated countless hits, who had spent her life in the shadows, met her end in the open, with no grand gestures, no elaborate escape, just a bullet and a quick disappearance. The unanswered questions that lingered after her death remain just as haunting as the myths that surrounded her life. Was it a personal vendetta from those who felt betrayed by her? Or was it the inevitable consequence of the brutal game she had played for so long? Was Blanco's death an attempt to settle old scores? Or was it simply a case of a fading legend being erased by a new generation of criminals who had no need for the past? Whatever the truth, her death left behind a legacy that was as complicated as her life. Blanco was never one to accept defeat, yet her final moments seemed to suggest that, in the end, she was just another casualty of a world she could no longer control. As the years pass, her name lives on, not just in the halls of history, but in the stories told by those who remember her reign, and the questions she left unanswered will echo in the shadows forever. Griselda Blanco's legacy, like the powder she once smuggled, lingers in the veins of the modern drug trade. Its impact felt long after her death. Her ruthless methods, once seen as groundbreaking, became the template for future drug lords, and the tactics she used to control territories and people would echo for years in the underworld. Her role in the cocaine trade didn't just build an empire. It helped shape the very fabric of global narcotics, smuggling, changing the rules of the game for those who followed in her footsteps. Blanco's ability to evade law enforcement for so long was a lesson in patience and survival, proving that sheer force could work when coupled with intelligence and a willingness to do whatever necessary to maintain power. Her influence extended far beyond just Miami or Colombia, laying the foundation for cartels in Mexico and Central America that would grow exponentially in the years to follow. The way she managed to build complex drug networks, organize violent enforcement, and utilize extreme secrecy would be adopted by cartels worldwide. Even in the years after her empire crumbled, Blanco's name continued to strike fear in the hearts of those who knew the true depths of her cruelty. She set a standard in the world of organized crime that seemed unachievable, creating a myth that would outlive her. A myth that portrayed her not only as a ruthless killer, but also a cunning businesswoman who understood how to play the game better than most. Her legacy was not just in the money she amassed or the lives she destroyed. It was in the way she forever altered the infrastructure of drug trafficking. But her lasting influence wasn't just in the malevolent example she set. Blanco also had a more subtle, and perhaps unintended, effect on the role of women in the narcotics world. She showed that a woman could command the same respect, or fear, as any man, an influence that would open doors for other female drug lords who would rise to power in the years to come. Her story became one of defiance, one that challenged the patriarchal dominance of the drug world and proved that a woman could, with enough grit, carve out her place in a world ruled by men. Despite the horrific violence and betrayal that marked her reign, Blanco became an iconic figure. Her name cemented in pop culture, often romanticized in films and documentaries. Her actions, both brutal and calculating, fueled the narrative of the cocaine cowboys era, with her story serving as both a warning and a source of fascination for generations to come. The world of drug trafficking may have moved on, but Blanco's ghost still lingers in the shadows of the cartels she helped shape, reminding everyone of the fear and power she commanded. In the end, Griselda Blanco's impact was felt not only in the streets of Miami and Medellin, but in every corner of the drug trade. She was a pioneer in the brutal business, leaving behind a legacy that, despite its violence, still serves as a point of reference in the ongoing saga of drug lords, their empires, and the blood they spill. The ripple effects of Griselda Blanco's cartel were far-reaching, touching every corner of the global drug trade and leaving a profound imprint on law enforcement and public perception alike. Her role in the explosion of the cocaine trade during the 1970s and 1980s was pivotal, setting off a chain reaction that would shape the very structure of drug cartels across continents for decades. Blanco's network wasn't just a business, it was a revolution in the way drugs moved from source to market. Her methods, which were as brutal as they were innovative, pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the drug trade. Blanco's influence on the global drug trade was immediate and profound. She established smuggling routes that ran from Colombia to the United States, a flow of cocaine that would only grow in volume and profitability. Her strategies, from using intricate smuggling methods to building unbreakable loyalty within her ranks, became a blueprint for cartels that followed. The connections she built between the cartels in Colombia and their counterparts in Mexico would later give rise to some of the most powerful cartels in history. The violence and fear that defined her reign were mirrored in the operations of those who followed, ensuring that the legacy of her cartel stretched far beyond her own time. For law enforcement, Blanco's cartel was an unprecedented challenge. Her ability to evade capture for so long set a new standard for the levels of sophistication that law enforcement agencies would have to adopt in their battle against drug cartels. Blanco's network was a lesson in how to hide operations, launder money, and remain untouchable, tactics that would become standard practice for cartels all over the world. In the years that followed her rise and fall, law enforcement would face an ever-evolving threat that Blanco had helped to create. Agencies like the DEA, once struggling to keep up, were forced to rethink their approach to drug cartels, adapting new methods, resources, and international cooperation to fight the sprawling syndicates that Blanco had helped to launch. Public perception of drug cartels was forever altered by Blanco's story. She was not the first drug lord, but her role as a female pioneer in a male-dominated industry made her story unique and, in many ways, more sensational. Her name became synonymous with the violent cocaine wars that plagued Miami and other cities, forever associating the drug trade with chaos and bloodshed in the minds of the public. The press played a massive role in shaping this narrative, presenting Blanco as the face of a brutal drug empire, and her image became a focal point for the media's depiction of cartels. The cocaine cowboys era, which Blanco helped define, became a cultural phenomenon, with films, documentaries, and books immortalizing the violence and drama of the time. The ripple effect of Blanco's cartel was a permanent fixture in the history of the drug trade. It didn't just affect the streets where drugs were sold, but rippled through law enforcement, the public's understanding of cartels, and the way drugs would be trafficked for decades to come. Her empire may have crumbled, but the systems and methods she put in place would continue to influence the drug trade long after her downfall. The legacy of Blanco's cartel became a shadow over every new cartel that rose, a haunting reminder of the power and destruction one woman could wield. The violent legacy left by Griselda Blanco cast a long shadow over the future of drug trafficking, both in the U.S. and abroad. Her reign, marked by ruthless efficiency and a staggering body count, became a blueprint for the cartels that would follow in her wake. Blanco didn't just run a drug empire. She orchestrated a wave of terror that reshaped the very nature of the drug trade, pushing it to new, more dangerous extremes. Her methods, which included betrayal, brutal executions, and strategic killings, would come to define an entire era of drug wars. Blanco's willingness to use violence as a tool of control set a precedent for the cartels that followed. In her world, loyalty wasn't given freely. It had to be demanded, enforced through fear and bloodshed. The streets of Miami, once bustling with the promise of opportunity, became a battlefield where the powerful played by their own rules and the weak were discarded with ruthless indifference. Blanco's willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat, whether through assassination or setting up her enemies to be killed, became the hallmark of her leadership. The bloodshed she caused wasn't an anomaly. It was part of her calculated strategy to maintain dominance and instill fear. She didn't just rule with an iron fist. She built an empire on violence, and that violence would follow the drug trade for decades. Her cartel's operations, which trafficked cocaine into the U.S. in unprecedented quantities, were marked by escalating brutality. As Blanco's influence spread, so too did the violence. Rival cartels learned from her use of terror, incorporating similar tactics into their own operations. The fear she instilled became a cornerstone of cartel culture, shaping the way the next generation of traffickers viewed their own power. For those in the drug business, violence became not just a consequence of betrayal but a necessary part of survival. Blanco's legacy was not merely in the drugs she moved or the fortunes she amassed, but in the environment of unrelenting fear she created. The impact of Blanco's violent empire wasn't confined to Miami or the U.S. It reverberated throughout the entire drug trade, influencing cartels across the globe. From Colombia to Mexico, the methods she pioneered, disguised shipments, extensive bribes, and calculated killings, became part of the standard playbook. As the cocaine trade expanded, so did the violence that came with it. Her rise to power was a signal to other traffickers. This was a brutal game, and only those willing to fight dirty would survive. Blanco may have fallen from grace, but the legacy of violence she left behind continued to fuel the bloodshed that would define the cartel wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Even after her death, the violent culture she nurtured persisted, shaping the way drug traffickers operated for years to come. Blanco's empire may have crumbled, but the violence she cultivated was an indelible mark on the drug trade, a brutal reminder of what it took to hold power in a world where life and death were determined by the whims of cartels. The legacy of violence she left behind would go on to shape the future of the industry, laying the groundwork for the bloody battles that would continue to unfold across the globe. Griselda Blanco's story was one that demanded to be told, and in the years following her fall from power, it was inevitably transformed into a larger-than-life myth. Her rise from the brutal streets of Colombia to become one of the most feared and influential drug lords in the world fascinated the public. And as the years went by, her life became the stuff of legend. The media, eager to capture the drama and spectacle of her reign, began to spin her narrative, turning a ruthless and calculating figure into something more cinematic, more memorable. What was once a story of violence, betrayal, and power struggles became, in the public's eye, the tale of a woman who defied all odds, built an empire from the ground up, and ruled with unparalleled dominance. Hollywood, documentaries, and books all seized upon Blanco's story, each offering their own version of her rise and fall. The media couldn't resist the allure of a female drug lord, a rarity in a male-dominated world of cartels. She became a symbol of defiance, a figure who challenged the traditional narrative of the drug trade. As the story of Blanco unfolded in films and television, her character morphed into an icon of fear, ambition, and tragedy. The public was captivated by the idea of a woman who was capable of the same ruthless actions as any male counterpart, but with the added complexity of her role as a mother and businesswoman. She was depicted as a mastermind, a cold and calculating figure who was always 2 steps ahead of her enemies, someone who used her intelligence as much as her power to dominate the cocaine trade. In film, Blanco was portrayed as both a villain and an anti-hero, depending on the lens through which her life was viewed. Some films focused on her brutal rise to power, highlighting her role in fueling the violent drug wars in Miami and her unapologetic ruthlessness. Others delved into her personal life, showing her vulnerability, the loss of her children, and the price she paid for the life she chose. This dichotomy made Blanco's portrayal on screen even more complex. She was both feared and respected, a woman who operated in a world where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal was inevitable. But despite the glamorization, the truth behind her myth was never fully captured in the media. Her story was one of violence, manipulation, and betrayal. The real Griselda Blanco was not a tragic figure seeking redemption. She was a powerful criminal mastermind who orchestrated countless deaths and destroyed lives. The media, however, preferred to focus on the spectacle, the larger-than-life character that Blanco had become. Over time, the lines between myth and reality blurred, and what remained was a portrayal of a woman who had once controlled an empire, who had ruled with violence and cunning, and who, in the end, became a myth in her own right. Griselda Blanco's ascent to power was marked by ruthless ambition and an unyielding determination to control the cocaine trade. However, as her empire grew, so too did the corrupting influence of power. What began as a means of survival in a brutal world transformed into a consuming obsession that twisted her morals and altered her relationships. Blanco, once a woman simply trying to escape poverty, became someone for whom loyalty, love, and even family took a back seat to maintaining her reign. The further she rose, the more she seemed to distance herself from the very people who had once been close to her. Her ability to manipulate and control those around her was extraordinary, and it became a tool she wielded with devastating effect. Blanco's paranoia grew as her influence spread, leading her to trust fewer people and treat others as pawns in her game. Relationships that could have once been nurtured with care turned into transactional alliances, where the only value was what someone could offer her in terms of power or information. She discarded people with ease, including family members and longtime associates, if they became liabilities in her pursuit of dominance. The very people who helped her rise, whom she had once seen as allies, soon became dispensable. The influence of power also shaped her decision-making. Blanco began to view everything through the lens of control: how to keep her empire intact, how to fend off rival cartels, how to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Her moral compass, once guided by survival and ambition, became increasingly warped as she justified violent actions, betrayal, and manipulation as necessary evils to preserve her position. What might have once been seen as unforgivable, even by her, became routine, a strategic move in a never-ending game where the stakes were her life and her empire. Blanco's relationship with her children was perhaps the most tragic example of how power had corrupted her. While she claimed to care deeply for her sons, the choices she made in the name of empire left them vulnerable, drawn into the same dangerous world she had created. Her children, caught in the crossfire of her decisions, were often victims of her obsession with control, leaving them with scars that could never heal. Even as they grew older, their fates were entwined with the violent legacy of their mother. Her affection for them, like her affection for all things, was tainted by the cold necessity of keeping her empire intact. The corrupting influence of power had a similar effect on Blanco's view of loyalty and trust. She had started out as someone driven by a desire for a better life, but as she gained power, she lost the ability to distinguish between loyalty and fear. In her eyes, everyone became either a tool or a threat. The result was an empire built on suspicion, manipulation, and violence, and a woman who had once fought to survive was now consumed by the very thing that had made her successful: her unchecked hunger for control. Griselda Blanco's rise to power came at an immense personal cost, one that would haunt her throughout her life. As she climbed the ranks of the cocaine trade, she was forced to make sacrifices that eroded the very relationships she had once cherished. The women who built empires often find themselves standing alone at the top, and Blanco was no exception. The sacrifices she made to secure her empire were not just those of material wealth, but of the intangible connections that give life meaning. Her ruthless ambition drove her to eliminate rivals, both in business and in personal life. Blanco became a master at cutting people off when they no longer served her goals, including family members. The price of power was a shrinking inner circle, a web of loyalty and betrayal that constantly shifted in her favor. She alienated her own sons, using them as pawns to further her empire's reach. Though she claimed to care for them, the truth was that they were tools in her high-stakes game. She would later be forced to watch the consequences of her actions play out in their troubled lives. The emotional toll of this fractured relationship would linger long after she lost control of her empire. The cost of Blanco's power was also paid in blood. Her reign was built on violence, manipulation, and the fear she instilled in others. Blanco's ability to eliminate threats swiftly and with precision ensured her place at the top of the cocaine trade, but each decision carried a heavy burden. The bodies she left in her wake were not just casualties of war, they were reminders of the kind of woman she had become. While she may have justified these actions as necessary for survival, they took a toll on her soul, leaving her increasingly isolated and paranoid. The crown she wore, forged in blood and betrayal, came with a constant weight of danger. Law enforcement, rival cartels, and even her own associates were all threats to her position. Blanco's empire was constantly under siege, and she had to navigate a world of shifting allegiances and ever-present violence. The personal cost of maintaining control was not just the loss of people she loved, it was the toll on her mental health. The constant need to stay one step ahead, the paranoia, and the isolation wore her down. She had become a woman who feared even her own reflection, knowing the price of her ambition had stripped away the very essence of the person she once was. The sacrifices Blanco made to maintain control were ultimately her undoing. As her empire crumbled, so too did the foundations of her existence. The world she built for herself was one of power and fear, but it left no room for peace or happiness. She had achieved everything she set out to do, only to realize too late that the cost of the crown was far higher than she ever could have imagined. Griselda Blanco's world was built on a foundation of family and loyalty, but both concepts were twisted by the brutality of the drug trade. In the underworld, loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was a currency. Blanco's ability to demand unwavering loyalty from those closest to her was both her strength and her downfall. She relied on her family to help build and maintain her empire, but the price of that loyalty was steep, and it would forever alter the course of their lives. Blanco's relationship with her sons is a testament to the complex dynamic she fostered. On one hand, she loved them, but on the other, she used them as pawns in a high-stakes game of survival and control. They were key players in her criminal empire, but the love she had for them was conditional. Their roles in her operations were cemented early on, and as she expanded her empire, she expected them to follow orders without question. Blanco never hesitated to involve them in the dangerous world she had created. blurring the lines between motherly affection and ruthless ambition. Yet, as the years went on, the cracks in their relationship began to show, particularly as her sons grew older and began to question the violent world they had been thrust into. Her sons were not the only ones who felt the weight of her loyalty tests. Blanco's relationships with her associates and even her lovers were governed by her strict code of trust and betrayal. In a world where deception was the norm, Blanco expected loyalty above all else. But her brand of loyalty was one of survival, not love. Those who proved disloyal to her or threatened her empire faced swift retribution, often death. Blanco's empire ran on fear, and loyalty was its currency. She ruled with an iron fist, demanding complete allegiance. But she didn't show mercy to those who fell out of favor. The price Blanco's family paid for their involvement in her empire was devastating. Her sons, who had been so deeply entrenched in the operations, eventually found themselves on the wrong side of her violent world. The isolation they experienced, the constant threat of violence, and the instability of living under their mother's regime ultimately destroyed their futures. The loyalty they had been raised to value became the very thing that cost them everything. For Blanco, loyalty meant unquestioning obedience and complete control. Yet, in the end, she was betrayed not just by her family, but by the very system she had built. The walls she had constructed around herself and her empire were made of fear, but even fear cannot protect a person forever. Blanco's inability to see the cost of her actions on the people closest to her, her need for constant loyalty, and her willingness to use her family as pawns in her game of power were the ultimate price of the empire she had built. And when it all came crashing down, her family paid the highest cost of all. Griselda Blanco's empire thrived in the shadows, a labyrinth of secret operations and hidden networks that kept her one step ahead of law enforcement and rival cartels. Beneath the surface of the sprawling drug trade, Blanco orchestrated a complex web of tunnels, both literal and metaphorical, that ensured her continued dominance. These hidden operations were the lifeblood of her criminal empire, allowing her to smuggle vast quantities of cocaine while evading the relentless pursuit of authorities. The smuggling routes Blanco used were far from ordinary. They weren't just the typical trade paths of cartels. Blanco built an extensive network of clandestine routes, paths that no one could trace or predict. She utilized warehouses, underground storage facilities, and secretive warehouses in plain sight to move her product with minimal detection. One of her most well-known methods was the use of hidden compartments in trucks, cars, and even boats. She was known for her ingenuity when it came to disguising shipments. Cocaine was hidden in boxes of fruit, furniture, even religious artifacts, making it almost impossible for authorities to detect without a detailed search. Her operations were coordinated with an eerie efficiency, something that only someone of her stature could achieve. She was constantly aware of the law's movements, able to track shifts in the government's approach and counteract them with precision. Blanco's ability to keep her operations running smoothly while staying hidden from the authorities came down to one thing: her connections. She maintained an extensive network of loyal informants and operatives on both sides of the law, feeding her constant intelligence that kept her steps calculated and measured. Blanco also relied heavily on a system of trusted associates who knew the importance of secrecy and loyalty. These operatives managed day-to-day operations in the field, reporting only to her, and maintained the discipline needed to ensure the empire stayed hidden from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Each associate had their part to play, whether it was ensuring the safe transport of cocaine or running the cash laundering operations that were crucial to the empire's financial success. She kept her most trusted loyalists in the fold, ensuring that each transaction, no matter how large or small, went through her trusted circle of insiders. The tunnels Blanco created were not just physical ones, but a world of silence and covert communication. She used payphones, coded messages, and hidden backdoor meetings to communicate with her inner circle. She even relied on encryption, learning from the mistakes of other cartels, and adapting her methods to stay one step ahead. The secrecy she cultivated was a skill that was as vital to her success as the product itself. Blanco's empire flourished under the cover of darkness, hidden behind a veil of deception and secrecy that allowed her to grow more powerful and dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. Her ability to control every part of the operation, from the smuggling of the cocaine to its distribution, was what made her so formidable. And in the end, it was these very hidden tunnels of power that kept her at the top, until the weight of her empire became too much to conceal. Griselda Blanco's rise to power in the male-dominated world of drug cartels was not just a tale of ruthless ambition and cunning, but one of defiance against a system that sought to undermine her at every turn. In an industry where men reigned supreme, Blanco faced constant challenges both from rivals who underestimated her and from the patriarchal norms that sought to confine her to the shadows. But she didn't just survive in this world. She thrived, carving out an empire that would later become one of the most infamous in history. From the moment she entered the drug trade, Blanco was aware of the resistance she would face as a woman. In a world where violence and power were almost exclusively held by men, she had to prove herself at every turn. She was faced with underestimation, prejudice, and a constant barrage of doubt from those around her. Yet, instead of retreating, Blanco fought back with the tools she had learned from the streets: intelligence, violence, and an uncanny ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. She became known for her cold, calculated demeanor, her willingness to do whatever it took to protect her empire, and, most importantly, her ability to command respect from men who were used to ruling unchallenged. As a woman at the top of her cartel, Blanco had to wield power differently. The traditional methods of cartel leadership, brute strength, explosive violence, were often met with skepticism when applied by a woman. However, Blanco was unyielding. She surrounded herself with a core group of loyal men and quickly became known for her ruthless tactics. Yet, despite her willingness to engage in the brutal violence that was part of the cartel life, she also used her gender as a weapon. Her opponents often found themselves at a disadvantage when they were caught off guard by the cunning and unpredictability of a woman who had little to lose and everything to gain. Blanco's rise was not without opposition. The men in the drug trade didn't just question her ability to lead, they resented it. There were constant attempts to undermine her, either through attempts to push her out or by seeking to replace her with more conventional male leadership. Yet, Blanco remained unwavering, slowly building her empire and carving out a space for herself in a world that never expected her to succeed. Her success wasn't just about outsmarting her competitors, it was about proving, time and time again, that a woman could not only hold her own in the cartel world, but could dominate it. As Blanco's reputation grew, so did the resistance to her leadership. Yet, she wasn't just fighting external forces. The misogyny that ran through the veins of the cartel world also reflected the battle within her own heart, a battle between the woman she had to be and the one she longed to become. Through it all, Blanco never softened. She maintained her grip on power, proving that her place in the drug world wasn't an accident. It was the result of sheer determination, brutal force, and an indomitable will. In the war on women in the cartels, Griselda Blanco was the victor. She defied the odds and built an empire that would forever change the way women were seen in the dangerous world of drug trafficking. Griselda Blanco's downfall signaled the end of an era for the Miami cocaine trade. For nearly a decade, she had been the queen of the drug world, the mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar empire that spanned continents. Her empire was built on cocaine, smuggling, violence, and a strategic manipulation of the underworld that few could rival. But as her arrest loomed and her empire crumbled, it was clear that the dynamics of the cartels and the drug trade itself were changing. Blanco's fall was not sudden, nor was it unexpected. The very empire she had built began to show cracks as law enforcement and rival cartels relentlessly pursued her. As the government's crackdown on the cocaine trade intensified, Blanco's operations became more difficult to maintain. The pressures of dealing with constant betrayals, law enforcement raids, and power struggles with her own associates began to take their toll. Blanco, once untouchable, found herself cornered, a shadow of the force she had once been. Yet, even in her decline, she remained a symbol of power, a reminder of the ruthlessness and the legacy of fear that defined the cocaine wars. When Blanco was arrested, it marked not only the end of her reign, but also a significant shift in the Miami cocaine trade. The methods she had used to control her empire, violence, manipulation, and strategic alliances, were no longer as effective. The cartel landscape was evolving, and the brutality that had defined her rule gave way to more strategic, less violent approaches. Rival cartels, like the Cali cartel, took advantage of Blanco's absence, using their newfound influence to take over her smuggling routes and operations. The cocaine trade was no longer a chaotic free-for-all. It became more structured, corporate, and calculated. The era of the old-school, blood-soaked cartels was over. Blanco's downfall also marked a turning point in how the public and law enforcement viewed drug cartels. Her high-profile arrest, and the media frenzy that followed, exposed the world to the sheer scale of the cocaine trade in the U.S. The public's perception of the cartels was forever changed, as the gritty, dangerous world of drugs and violence was brought into sharp focus. The story of Griselda Blanco, the cocaine godmother, became a cautionary tale, a symbol of both the power and the inevitable downfall that came with it. In the wake of Blanco's arrest, the dynamics of the Miami cocaine trade shifted. The old players were either arrested, killed, or replaced, and the power structure began to change. New players emerged, and the cocaine trade continued to flow, but the face of the industry was different. The once violent, unpredictable world of the cartels gave way to a more strategic, corporate-driven operation. The end of Blanco's reign was not just the end of an era for her empire. It was the end of the chaotic, lawless world that had once been the Miami cocaine trade. The power vacuum she left behind shaped the future of the cartels, and the drug trade would never be the same again. Griselda Blanco's life has transcended the realm of reality, evolving into a myth that continues to inspire stories, legends, and warnings about the cost of power. The cocaine godmother, once feared and revered, has become a symbol of both ruthless ambition and the ultimate price of unchecked control. Her rise from the gritty streets of Colombia to the heights of a multi-million-dollar empire is a tale that seems almost too surreal to be true, yet it holds a raw power that captivates those who hear it. In death, she became a cautionary figure, a reminder of the lengths one can go to in the pursuit of dominance and the inevitable downfall that follows. Her myth is not just about her criminal empire, but about her sheer willpower, her indomitable spirit, and the way she carved her name into history. Even now, decades after her fall from grace, her name is whispered in the underworld, her story retold in the media, and her influence felt in the world of drug trafficking. Blanco's life, characterized by violence, manipulation, and cunning, remains a touchstone for anyone who enters the dangerous game of the cartels, a warning of the cost of wielding power without limits. But the myth of Griselda Blanco is not solely about admiration or respect. It also serves as a stark reminder of the emptiness of that power. Her legacy is built on bloodshed and betrayal, and the stories surrounding her are filled with the warning of what happens when loyalty is twisted and lives are sacrificed in the pursuit of wealth and control. Blanco's empire crumbled, and she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of both fear and fascination. Those who idolized her as a powerful female leader in a male-dominated world were soon reminded of the brutal, unpredictable nature of her ambition. The myth of Griselda Blanco lives on in popular culture, immortalized in documentaries, films, and books. Her name has become synonymous with the excess and danger of the drug trade, and her life is now a part of the dark, almost mythical fabric of the cartel era. In stories and films, she is portrayed as a complex figure, a woman who fought and clawed her way to power in a world that sought to crush her. The truth of her life may be buried in layers of fiction and exaggeration, but the essence of her story remains compelling, a tale of rise, fall, and the unyielding thirst for control. As the years pass, the myth of Griselda Blanco continues to evolve, taking on new meanings. She is no longer just a woman who ran one of the most powerful cartels in history. She is a legend, an icon of the underworld whose name evokes both fear and fascination. And as long as stories are told of the drug trade, Griselda Blanco's name will live on, forever intertwined with the myth of power, ambition, and the price one pays to claim the crown.